Thank you for trusting us with your time on an incredibly important, consequential day. This session on AI, religion, and big tech, we think we have just the perfect pair to lead the conversation. Just to say a couple quick words about Faith Angle is frame this. Faith Angle basically has the conviction that religion is always in the room. It's true in business, it's true in cabinet level meetings, it's true in tech. Religion's always in the room. And so our goal is to sort of unwrap that a bit today as we go. We obviously are talking about the big transition to AI, the biggest thing that's happening in our world. We're talking later today about charisma and the idea of political and religious leaders being affected by a charism and connection with people that they tell stories to. And then tomorrow we'll talk about immigration and religion. And to lead this conversation, we have just fantastic people. And now look, if I give you the whole Zvika biography, we're going to be here all day. So I'm just going to be brief. Let me introduce first Emma, who's going to really lead this as a conversation that we hope to be able to share with others as well. Emma is a columnist at the New York Times. She's the features writer that's there. Her first book, Life on the Line, Young Doctors Come to Age in a Pandemic, won a bunch of awards. She's won the Sydney Award from the Hillman Foundation. She's run RNA's Award for Excellence in Feature Writing. I have a friend who's a Faith Angle advisor who says, you better keep an eye on her. She's going to be running that place someday. So we're going to enjoy Emma leading us off. And she's going to be talking with Zvika Krieger, who is a rabbi in Silicon Valley. He was also the first director of responsible innovation at Meta. As you know from his bio, he's done a bunch in the sort of private sector with TikTok and Google, with Airbnb, with Pixar, with the World Economic Forum. And again, I think if we read the whole bio, we wouldn't get into it. So thank you for leading a conversation that's described in your book. Emma, take it away.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm really excited for the conversation. And Zvika and I both wanted to emphasize we want it to be an exchange. And we hope that what we kind of set the stage talking about just is kind of a series of provocations that opens up discussion, because all of you are bringing so much expertise and reporting and history and research into the room. And so we hope to really get into it. When I was thinking about the topic of this session, faith in the age of big tech, I was thinking about what I've been really fascinated for years is the kind of narratives around secularization in the US and this kind of tidy story that was being told that people were de-churching, the rise of the nuns, like the unaffiliated. And that was a narrative that I think really made sense to a lot of people, because when you look around the world, like we all have these phones in our pocket that Jonathan Haidt had a term for it. He called phones wonder killers, which I think is just a great term. Like you pull out your phone and you have instantly the answer to anything. And so how do you even have kind of the mental space to start asking the bigger questions? We're just in such a short circuit of attention and information. And so I think it made sense to a lot of people that people were de-churching and younger people were not feeling such a sense of connection or affiliation with large religious institutions, also for many kind of social and political reasons. But I was really fascinated to see a study earlier this year that found that actually that trend was kind of coming to a halt. And Pew polling found that for the first time in many years, actually, levels of church attendance were stabilizing, and that a lot of the kind of reversal in disaffiliation was being driven by young people. And I felt like that came to life in my reporting over the last year, because I've been going to so many different communities and spaces around the country where I've seen both institutional leaders and ordinary people talk about how they see faith animating their lives, from the political to the cultural to the social to the technological. And so I've seen this earlier this year. I went to church with Trey Stevens, who co-founded Anduril, which is a defense technology startup that makes autonomous drones and other autonomous weaponry, one of the fastest growing in the defense tech sector. And he had talked about how he's bringing in all of these young Silicon Valley people into Christian faith. And then I went to NatalCon, which is the largest gathering of the pronatalism movement, where again, faith was really center stage. And it was this interesting sort of alliance between technologists, the sort of, in the Elon Musk school of wanting to reverse plummeting fertility rates, and then cultural conservatives and religious Christians and others who have been talking about that for quite some time. And then I saw that again at homeschooling conventions, at Turning Point, at Trump rallies. And so I think in so many different social, political, technological spaces, we've seen faith kind of elevated in new ways in this moment. And I think it raises a lot of really interesting questions about the ethical implications of the way that faith is being spoken about by some leaders in these spaces. And also kind of the opportunities there of how we can allow faith and faith conversations to influence some of the really big thorny decisions that are happening around technological innovation, AI, and political change in this moment. And so I was really excited to talk about this with Zvika because he has this fascinating perspective of having been on the inside of the room in tech spaces, in Meta and TikTok, and in religious spaces as leading a religious community in the Bay Area. So with that, Zvika and I have been talking about how we wanted to structure the session, and we sort of divided the overall topic into two categories. One is this big question of AI is destabilizing the world, our sense of meaning, certainly our sense of work, and kind of the possibility and the rate of change. So how can or should faith and faith leaders respond? And then the second kind of set of questions is around how faith leaders ought to be incorporating technology and the opportunities and the risks around technology more into their work. So we see that as sort of two sides of a coin. And so the question that we wanted to start is in that first category. And the question is really, how ought faith to steer the ethics of technological development, if at all? Should faith have a role in the conversation? And if so, how can we sort of shape the role that it does have? And so I've now talked for a little while, so I want to kick it over to Zvika on that question because you come from this fascinating background of having worked in the tech space and been the Facebook rabbi, and you've made some interesting provocations when we were talking about what role you think faith should have in these big, thorny ethical conversations about tech and AI.
It's a great question. Thanks for the really great intro, and it's so nice to be here with everyone. And it's actually quite rare where I feel like I live two lives to a certain extent. Like half time I work at TikTok, half time I'm a rabbi of a synagogue, and like rarely do those halves of myself intersect. And so this room is one of those few spaces, and so it feels really nice to be able to bring my full self into a conversation. And I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth because rarely do I talk about those things together. So as you mentioned, I worked at Meta for a number of years. I ran a team called the Responsible Innovation Team, where we had about 40 people on the team, and our job was to review all the products that were being developed across the company and to help product teams potentially anticipate the ways in which products might perpetrate harm on users and help product teams mitigate those harms. So obviously we did an amazing job. No, but we had like quite a few wins, and just imagine what the world would look like if we hadn't existed. But most people like assume that there's this like natural complementarity between like being a rabbi and like providing product teams with ethical guidance. And I would say that like, just to be totally honest, like I actually didn't feel like there was like a lot of overlap between those worlds. There's an interesting discourse right now in the sort of like a sort of rising scholarship around kind of like what role religious ethics can play in sort of helping guide tech ethics. And I frankly find those conversations to be essentially purely academic or conceptual or philosophical. Like there's people who are like, someone wrote this interesting article about like, what can we learn about like the ethics of autonomous vehicles by like looking into the Talmud and like the sort of like your ox gored my ox and like who's responsible for this. And I'm like, okay, like that's like conceptually interesting, but like the outcome of like the quote unquote guidance that maybe the Talmud provided in that situation, like I could have come at that if I knew nothing about the Talmud, right? And so it's like, there's like this interesting intellectual discussion of like using the Bible or spiritual texts to like guide those conversations, but like, it isn't actually all that useful, especially if you're like with a group of engineers who are just like, all right, like I don't have time for this. Like, just tell me what to do. Like, I don't want to like get into this whole hermeneutical discussion about this. I would say that like where religion, faith, spirituality came into play is, like a lot of what my job was it was more like on the culture side in these companies, which was encouraging people that when they felt a sense like, oh, this, like something's wrong here, or like this product might potentially harm people, like empowering people to say, okay, that voice where you're like this feels kind of icky, like you should speak out about that, right? And like you should trust your own inner moral compass. And so, what a lot of people wanted to do was sort of like outsource their ethics to me, right? They were like, all right, Rabbi, like tell us what to do, right? Like, because a lot of what I did is like frame trade-offs for people and say like, okay, like you could optimize for this or you could optimize for that. Because the most interesting conversations in these tech companies was not, most people assume that you'd be in these meetings and there'd be like, okay, we can launch this new feature and it's going to bring us a ton of money and a ton of new users, but it's going to like harm this marginal, vulnerable population. Like, what should we do? Like, and rarely was that the conversation, right? And I don't really drink the Kool-Aid. I'm very willing to like critique these companies, but like if that was the conversation, generally we would do the right thing. But a lot of times it was what we would call, it wasn't right versus right, but right versus wrong, but right versus right? It's like, are you gonna, like in some situations, there might be a trade-off between like privacy and safety. And how do you optimize between those two things? And a lot of times, so I saw my job as, let me frame the trade-offs or help people frame the trade-offs, and they would say, okay, great, what should we do? And I was like, well, like I'm not the ethical sage here that tells you the right thing to do. Like, let me help you articulate what your values are and how do you make decisions based on those values. And in some ways, that was actually kind of similar to what I do as a rabbi. That a lot of people come to me as a rabbi and they'll be like, Rabbi, I'm in my 60s and my spouse is in their 70s and they have dementia and I want to put them in a nursing home or an assisted living facility, but I feel guilty about it. Like, what should I do? And I'm like, okay, it sounds like you already know what you want to do and you're looking for me to like give like a rabbinic stamp of approval on that. And it's like, let me like walk beside you in that decision making and to tap into your own moral compass rather than like telling you what to do. And so that was kind of, I would say like that was in some ways, so like that's a sort of long way of saying that like I didn't really feel like I was like drawing on religious or spiritual ethical traditions to aid in decision making because it felt a little like one step removed from like the day-to-day of what we had to do building products. My background is a product designer, and so it was just like nitty-gritty engineers are just like, all right, tell us what to do. And I think like maybe one last thing I'll say, and you and I were talking about this in regards to your article about the guy who runs Anduril. I have like a block against his name, Trey Stevens, right, where it's just like, you kind of have to, when someone is like sort of the poster child of like Christianity in Silicon Valley, and that person is the CEO of a defense contracting firm creating killing machines, it's like, you got to like take a step back and ask yourself like, okay, like, well, what does it mean to be religious and to bring your religiosity into your development of technology products? And I think that in a lot of ways, religion is a bit of I don't know if a blank canvas or Rorschach test, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but like you can find a religious justification for basically anything. And so to sort of, people presume that they're like, oh, there's like a religion has an answer to these questions. And it's like, no, actually you can use religion to justify almost any answer. And so it's not, like it doesn't have that sort of definitive guiding light that maybe people think it would.
Yeah, that's fascinating. As I was listening to you, it sounds like some of the conversations you were having, like the role that religion can play almost sometimes is like, it's like a gut tuner, or like, it kind of helps you listen to or develop your own sense of ethical guidelines. And I feel like sometimes in these conversations, faith is almost framed as like, it's like a USB. Like you can just kind of upload all of the right decisions and knowledge as opposed to like a systems update or something, like you're fine tuning your own ability to navigate these decisions, which like life requires of you every day. But another thing I was thinking about as you were talking is that I actually think that perspective that you were voicing is quite rare, especially among the people who are making high-level decisions in tech companies, in AI companies, also in political institutions right now, where I think the tendency is very much going in the opposite direction of, people are sort of arriving at these positions of power and high-level decision-making and then grasping around for a sense of sort of meaning-making to cloak it in and to make it sound more kind of ethical and authoritative and spiritually authoritative. And one of the realms where I've been seeing that play out a lot, which I just wanted to mention, is Peter Thiel's been on a lecture circuit about the Antichrist. And I ended up going down a rabbit hole and listening to many, many hours of him on various podcasts, which I know Zoe has as well, as she has written about this too. And he's developed this really complicated system of ideas around Christian faith and the Antichrist. And he actually has delivered them over the course of the last few weeks in a closed-door lecture series in San Francisco about the Antichrist. And if you listen to some of these ideas, it's quite alarming, especially when you think about the fact that it's coming from the mouth of someone who holds immense influence over technology, over the platforms we use, over the direction of the industry because he's directing funds and Founder Fund, and over our political system because he's become sort of a right-wing kingmaker. And just to kind of briefly summarize what I've heard him talk about, he has kind of framed, basically, his belief is that recently he's been saying critics of AI and of technology could be sort of legionnaires of the Antichrist. He's given examples like Greta Thunberg because of her criticisms of capitalism. What Peter Thiel has been saying recently is that people who are criticizing AI and technology are potentially sort of portenders of doom, right? Like the Antichrist is this idea that it's like a figure that would unify humanity under one rule. And Peter Thiel is very concerned about, I actually wrote down a quote because I didn't want to butcher his thinking, but he said, how might such an Antichrist rise to power? By playing on our fears of technology and seducing us into decadence. And a lot of scholars of Christianity have been very critical of him, but he has many, many listeners and followers, particularly people who already sort of are admirers of his work at Palantir, at Founders Fund, at PayPal, and now they're seeing him as this kind of quasi-religious and spiritual authority, and so they're kind of accepting wholesale everything he's saying. And I think it's worth a quick diversion too. One of Thiel's mentors is René Girard, who was a theologian and a literary critic, and kind of following the trail of René Girard's thinking and writing into Thiel's work is fascinating and illuminating because it shows, I think, how pliable a lot of these ideas can be. So René Girard was a literary critic at Stanford. He kind of came to prominence through this book called Desire, Deceit, and the Novel, in which he basically theorized that all desire is mimetic. So people want what other people want. And originally where Girard was really focused is on basically how the novel, the French novels are an example of this, because novels are animated by mimetic desire, by people coveting what other people want, including romantically. And then as Girard kept kind of thinking and studying, he developed that idea and applied it more to faith. And he believed that basically the person who broke the cycle of mimetic desire was Jesus Christ. And the way for individuals to break the cycle of mimetic desire, just coveting what other people want, is by following Jesus Christ. And Peter Thiel took from a lot of this work basically the idea of how powerful mimesis is. And we see that very much in Facebook, right? Like Facebook, Instagram, all these platforms are based on people coveting what other people want and how much that animates our everyday actions. And so in some circles, Girard is actually referred to as the godfather of the like button. Thiel recently went to a conference of admirers and fans of Girard where he delivered his Antichrist lecture and had an interesting back and forth with someone in the crowd where someone asked Thiel, so what should we do? This is a lot of doomsaying. You're talking about the Antichrist. What should any of us do about it? And he said, I'm not here to give advice. And someone in the audience was like, well, René Girard would. He would just say we should all go to church. And that's something that Peter Thiel has been saying in many of his lectures recently. So I went into that whole tangent because I think sometimes I've had conversations with people where they're like, why does it even really matter what this person, like his very complex and sometimes sort of opaque ideas about Christianity. And I think it's extremely concerning and worthy of sort of conversation and study because, again, he's directing the flow of so much money right now, directing where innovation is headed. And I think it's really telling and sort of alarming if someone with a lot of power in the tech industry is standing in front of a lot of audiences and going on Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and every high-profile podcast to say that critics of tech and AI are the Antichrist. Including, he said that about like Nick Bostrom, who's one of the very high-profile critics of AI, and Eliezer Yudikowsky. So I guess all of that is to say, I think the perspective that Zvika was saying is pretty, I would say, counterculture in tech circles. But I'm curious what you think, because you're closer to a lot of this. Do you, do you often get a lot of pushback to this idea that spiritual authorities can't be sort of the decision makers in the tech space, or that it doesn't have a role to play?
Well, yeah, maybe I should add some nuance to my comment. I mean, so when I worked at Meta, my desk, no one has an office, but my desk was right outside Mark Zuckerberg's door, and like Sheryl Sandberg's was right next on the other side of me. And I spent a lot of time in meetings with them, and like it's interesting because both, the two most powerful people at Facebook are not only Jewish, but like pretty, like I don't think people realize how deeply like Judaism plays a role in Mark's life, and like he was part of a weekly Torah study class, and Cheryl's been like a lot more public, and actually especially since leaving, and like it's like I heard, I can't give like specifics because of my NDA, but I heard both of them sort of lean on their Jewish background in a number of different meetings to sort of justify or sort of inform decisions they're making. And me being the rabbi, like I was often like I would generally wouldn't say this during meetings, but either would like find them afterwards or not say it at all. Being like, oh, like well, like there's actually like lots of Jewish sources that would justify the exact opposite decision that you're making, or one, and that one can. So I think it's important to kind of put that out there, that it's not like religion can be used to justify decisions in multiple different directions, and you're definitely seeing it, and it's interesting. I mean, you see it all over. You see it in politics as well, right? Where you see like the Pope coming out and saying like, how can you call yourself pro-life when you're treating immigrants this way, right? So it's like we pick the religious justifications that fit what we want to do in the world. I do think that religious communities have a really important role to play in a lot of these discussions, and I think that I'm less interested in a lot of the theological discussions. Like I was invited to like the Pope convened this like convening on like Catholicism and AI at the Vatican, and like brought together all these thinkers, and it was like super interesting and completely irrelevant to like anything that's happening in Silicon Valley. But I think that there's like moral authority, right, in terms of really forcing companies to grapple with the ethical considerations of this. But there's also, I think, a socially constructive force that faith communities can play in terms of norms around like what their expectations are around technology products. I think particularly around children, and the way that that's like a big part of the discourse right now is the impact of tech on children. And I think that we're not there can be a constructive role in terms of like pressuring the companies, but there can actually just be more of like a norm setting role in saying like, hey, like we're not going to allow our kids on social media until a certain age. We're not going to give our kids cell phones. Like there actually isn't a lot of places where parents can get educated on sort of effective use of social media or technology, or particularly when it's coming to AI right now. And so I actually think religious communities can and should step in terms of like playing that moderating force, because I actually don't think government's going to be playing that role anytime soon. And so I think there's a really important role of faith communities. That's like one area where I do see a lot of promise and like potential where they could step up.
I'm really glad you raised the term of faith communities, because I do think in so many of the young kind of tech workers that I've interviewed I think they've been very sort of drawn to some of the Peter Thiel or the Trey Stevens or some of the other sort of tech leaders turning toward faith because of this kind of meaning vacuum that they're experiencing. And I think people have, this is not like a new problem, but I think for a lot of people, it's accelerated by it's accelerated by the kind of rate of technological change, by political tumult. Like people feel very unmoored. And particularly if you're in a very sort of like white collar office job, and you see ahead of you this kind of like ladder that you're trying to climb. You're a product manager and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's next on my sort of professional trajectory, and you see these kind of like big conversations swirling around about the ethical implications of the work you're doing, but it feels very sort of bifurcated, or like it feels far from your everyday, and people really want some sort of higher sense of meaning and authority and structure. And I think some of these tech leaders and the talk that they're making around faith is appealing to the desire for meaning, but not community. Like it doesn't go deeper to the level of actually transforming your life, because you're not necessarily doing it in relationship with other people. And so this, I think, gets to the next question that we wanted to talk about, is a little bit of like, what's the role of faith in a moment when so much of our sense of meaning has been destabilized, and we don't even know what jobs are going to be around in a decade, or we don't know what our jobs are going to look like, or what your job actually asks of you in terms of writing or research, or everyone feels like their job is sort of an under existential threat. And so how can faith communities sort of respond to this moment of destabilization?
Yeah, so you said so many interesting things that I want to just like quickly touch on. So one is just like, definitely like, I think there is a crisis of meaning in Silicon Valley itself. I mean, I will say that in my first day working at Facebook, which was in 2020, one of the C-suite leaders who was giving like the opening remarks at like your first day orientation, he goes on the mic and he says, welcome to Facebook. It's called Facebook back then. How many of you were embarrassed to tell your friends and family that you were working here? And like 90% of the people raised their hand, right? That was like—
What year was that?
The 2020,
okay.
Right? And so like, this is like the opening remark, like the rah-rah, like boot camp of like getting you excited to work here. And it was just, and the fact that he was just so blatant in saying it. And actually, I can actually show you here, this is my Facebook backpack here. And they used to say Facebook on the front, and then now it's on the inside, and it's the same color. and that was like they said it explicitly that like people didn't want to wear the swag because like who wants to be walking down the street in a T-shirt or a backpack that says Facebook on it? And so someone confirmed for me that the name used to be on the outside of the backpack, and they moved it monochromatically into the inside. And so one of the ways that we because people are always asking me like, why did your team exist? Like why was Facebook investing in responsible innovation? Clearly, people's judgment is that it doesn't seem to care about actually innovating responsibly. It was this just what they call ethics washing, like trying to like parade us out to Congress or to journalists and like look at it, we have this amazing responsible innovation team. And there are a lot of different ways to answer that question, and people want to go down that route. We can go down that route later. But one of the things to get to what you're saying is that there was a lot of research that showed that employee satisfaction was directly correlated to feeling like the company does the right thing, and that people felt that they were empowered to speak out when they saw something was like. Because you would see these headlines, working at Facebook, you would see these headlines every morning. You'd wake up and be like, Facebook has done this horrible thing, Facebook has done that horrible thing, or having this, and like giving people a sense that they actually could change, that they could have they can be empowered to change things, directly correlated to employee satisfaction and retention. Facebook does a ton of research about how to keep employees at the company. All tech companies do this, because not so much now, but like definitely then there was a war for talent. And so retaining people was a really, like there were people leaving every day, and in the exit interviews, a lot of these things, they were leaving for these reasons, right? I mean, often you'd get a better job somewhere, but it was easy to leave if you were like, oh, this company I'm working at is like not doing good things in the world. And it's particularly true for millennials. And so a lot of like what justified the work, how we, from a business case, not just from like a do-gooder case, but from a business case that we could justify the responsible innovation work, was like, oh, this helps keep millennials working here. And so there are other reasons too, which we can talk about later, but that was, but it sort of tied to what you're saying about crisis of faith. And I would definitely say that there's like, people are struggling as tech is seen as less and less a force for good in the world. People are struggling with meaning and like, what am I doing here? How am I contributing to this? I mean, my community, we were talking about this last night, the community that I lead, I mean, this is on a micro level, but when I started in the community that I lead, almost 4 years ago, we had 120 member families, and now we have almost 450 over the past 3 years. And a lot of those people are Silicon Valley tech CEOs, C-suite, startup founders, and just in conversation with them, a lot of them are like, we're looking for meaning, we're looking for something sort of less ephemeral, something that can help us find purpose. But I'd also say the flip side, to get more to your question, is that Silicon Valley is in some ways like the tip of the spear when it comes to layoffs and work dislocation, right? We had these massive layoffs that happened in the past year or two, and a lot of that affected my community. A lot of people started coming to my community after they were laid off and sort of in search of I founded my whole identity on being a product manager or an engineer and climbing the corporate ladder and getting all the gold stars. And I was laid off for in this very unceremonious way. And it's very traumatizing for people because they're I thought this company really cared about me. They talked all this talk about we're a family and we're here for you and we're here to take care of you. And we're that was all just, corporate BS to make me feel better about working here. And then I unceremoniously get this email that says you're fired, you're going to be locked out of your email by the end of the day. And it was really traumatizing for people. Wow, I can't rely on my job for meaning. And the problem also is that now, and then all these people are struggling to find work now because, there have been layoffs across the whole industry. And so I've seen this first, had a front row seat from a pastoral perspective of how do I support people that are going through this crisis of meaning when they've lost their jobs? And I do think that in many ways as a society, we have outsourced meaning to our jobs. I think most people find their primary sense of fulfillment and identity and mission or purpose through the work that they do. And I think we're really going to have to grapple with those questions when, first of all, lots of people are going to get laid off over the next 1 to 5 years as it relates to AI. I mean, it's just crazy how fast those trends are moving. And I think we're going to, I think we're in for a fundamental realignment in society around jobs and work. I don't think we're going to get to a place anytime soon around universal basic income, and we can kind of go down that rabbit hole if we want to discuss that later. But I think what it means to work and have a job and outsource your meaning to that is not going to be what we've seen over the past, 50, 100 years. I don't know how long this has been going on for. It's going to be fundamentally changed because of AI and the nature of work. And I think that faith communities aren't the only place that can help people make meaning of that, but I think they're one of the primary communities, and I think that we're going to see a large uptick in people turning to faith in that context.
I completely agree with you. I also think something that I feel I've seen over and over again in places I've reported over the last year is that when people have a hole of meaning in their lives, they're going to fill it with something. And they're often going to fill it with the voice that's sort of the most in their face and also feels viscerally connected to their own personal problems and their everyday lives. And I've seen this a lot, just as an example, in what I've been finding in my reporting is that there's a very strong Maha to MAGA pipeline. And what I mean by that is I've gone to a lot of conferences for the young right in the last year, and I meet a lot of people who used to either identify as more left-wing or they just didn't follow politics at all. And during the pandemic, which we haven't really touched on yet, but I think was sort of a kind of crucible for a lot of people of their senses of meaning making were disrupted. They were locked down at home. They didn't know what institutions to trust. They didn't trust public health authorities. They were getting all these mixed messages, and they weren't in-person workplaces in a lot of in a lot of sectors. And so people were feeling a crisis of meaning making. And the voices that were sort of the loudest then were a lot of the kind of anti-institutionalist, anti-public health, in some cases misinformation, and often right-leaning authorities. And I've met a lot of people at Turning Point events, for example, who were feeling a kind of crisis of meaning during the pandemic. And then they found podcasts that were telling them to question vaccines, to get off of birth control. And then there's all the kind of subcategories of that of, ditch seed oils, stop eating ultra-processed foods. But I think the bottom line is that it felt very much to people like something they could integrate into their everyday lives. which to some people is religious practice. Like if you pray a certain number of times a day, if you have a community that you turn to, if you do something physically in the day that makes you feel in tune with your faith, then that's one version. But for other people, it's kind of health and wellness. And if you're eating certain things, if you're questioning pharmaceuticals and what you put in your body, I think people want like a sort of meaning making that feels like they can integrate it into their everyday very easily. And so what I've seen for some people is that it is kind of tuning into like religious authorities and religious voices. But for other people, I think it is the kind of political kind of tinged with wellness dialogue that's going on. And so I guess what I've found in a lot of these spaces is that like when people have a sense of like a hole in their lives with regard to meaning because they don't exactly feel grounded in their work, or because they don't have a sense of in-person community that comes with their work, or because they don't know what sort of authorities or institutions to trust, they fill that hole with something, and sometimes it's just the loudest voice. And so I think that kind of poses a challenge to religious communities. And I'd be curious to hear about your experience with Chokhmat Halev in this regard, because you're dealing with a lot of people who feel unmoored in their work, like you said, or who like work doesn't occupy the same central role that it once did. So how does religion or how do religious leaders kind of step up to help people navigate those moments when they're also being flooded in their social media platforms and their algorithms with voices that are sort of saying, actually, it's much easier. All you have to do is listen to Alex Clark or Allie Beth Stuckey, or there's a million of the manosphere and womanosphere and right-wing podcasters who are filling that space. I'm curious, like, can religious leaders play in that? How do you redirect people?
Totally. We can talk a lot about the Maha to Maga pipeline. I feel like the Bay Area is sort of ground zero for a lot of that. Definitely no seed oils allowed in our community. I think that actually maybe to broaden the conversation a little bit, I think that we're seeing both a cause and a symptom or an outcome of this is like looking at the growth of generative AI and particularly around companion bots and the way that people are actually turning to AI to answer this question, right? And so it's like, what's interesting about AI is it's both causing this problem in that you're people are losing all their jobs and so they're looking for meaning, and then AI is coming out of their side and actually that's what people are turning to for meaning. And based on my what I saw working inside companies like TikTok, but there's so much publicly available information at this point too. It is just staggering the number of people that are turning to what are called companion bots or conversation bots. Like it way eclipses any of the business cases that we're seeing around AI, and particularly around younger generations. Like I saw a statistic the other day that 72% of teenagers in America interact with companion bots on a regular basis. So this is not, and so it's true for adults today, but it's also true for, it's definitely becoming true for the next generation. And I think that it's such a symptom of the fact of this loneliness epidemic that we're in right now. People are just, and coming on the heels of COVID, we were talking about COVID where people kind of forgot how to socialize, or sort of, or there's a lot of interesting research that it kind of, released this pent up social anxiety that people had, and in some ways gave permission to people who are feeling social anxiety to withdraw even more. And so we're seeing that people, just an inordinate number of people are turning to AI for companionship, for friendship, for romantic partnership. I know it's you can sort of roll your eyes and be like, oh, that's just the fringe weirdos on Reddit, but it's actually the numbers are staggering in terms of the number of people who are turning to AI for romantic partnership, and also people who are just can't find romantic partnership, and they're just I'm going to just be in a relationship with this AI bot, and it sounds crazy, but I actually spend a lot of time working in these companies, interviewing users who engage in these kinds of behaviors, and it's they're actually pretty normal people, and they make they don't think, on the one hand they're rational in that they know it's not another human being, but they also suspend rationality in terms of being in relationships with these people. And so I think that on the one hand, there's a symptom, right, in the sense that like people are really lonely, and human relationships are hard. They're complicated, they're messy, and these chatbots, like they are optimized to remove all the friction of human relationships, right? They're endlessly affirming. They're optimized for making you, they're optimized for engagement. They're optimized to make you want to keep coming back and using the product more and more. And so they like, they'll just like endlessly affirm you. They won't challenge you. And that is, really it feels really nice, but it's really bad for then learning how to deal with like real human relationships. And then there's all this research, and I've seen both anecdotally and at scale, data about how people who use these conversational or companion bots or conversation bots on a regular basis, like they see a shrinking of their IRL friend group, and they report like a lack, like a more resistance and like losing those muscles of real human-to-human engagement. So it's just a self-perpetuating cycle in that way. And so I think a few different like implications on the faith side, right, is that like there is a hunger clearly for community and for connection, and how can faith communities serve that? And it's in certain sense there's like competition for that, right? Like you are competing against chatbots now, and chatbots that create a very frictionless, seamless relationship. And like actually the data shows that in some ways they are like for some people they are as emotionally nourishing as real, because like you can kind of dismiss it and roll your eyes and say, well, it's like great, I'm glad they're going to that, but it's not as good as real friends or as real human being friends. And it's like, well, what do you mean by good? Like as good, right? Like let's like break that down. And it's like, let's look chemically at like the dopamine that gets released when you're in a relationship. Like, well, actually there's some nascent research that's showing like similar things get released when you're in conversation with chatbots, right? And like, let's look at people who are like neurodivergent and, or, who struggle to make friendships. Like what about those people? And so I think that in some ways like that is the competition that faith communities are engaging with, but I also think that there's like an imperative to like help people be in relationships that are not frictionless, and that like help people learn how to engage in conflict and be in community with people of difference. And like I think we're also already seeing a lot of the perils of this sorting that's happening. That's a discourse that's been happening for 20 years now, where people are like sorting into communities and only surrounding themselves by people who agree with them. And then with social media, you're in these filter bubbles of like only following or only getting fed content that people agree with you. Now imagine AI, where you're sort of in friendships and romantic relationships with people that only agree with you and affirm you. Like I think we're going to see a further exacerbation of that trend as well.
It's so interesting to hear you use the term compete, even because like what hope should faith communities be competing with the way that with AI as like a force for structuring relationships, or is it just like can those two even be in competition, or are they just in different planes? Like what would that competition
Well,
be?
I think the other thing is that I think that on the one hand, I made the case that actually interacting with AI can be as satisfying as interacting with a human, especially as the technology improves, and we're sort of crossing that threshold right now. And like I think there is also research that shows that there are benefits to in-person interaction, IRL, that is more rewarding and nourishing and satisfying to people. But we're coming to a place where actually the only way that you're really going to be able to know if you're talking to a human being is being in the flesh with them, right? Like I was recently on a Zoom meeting with somebody who I thought was in the Zoom meeting, and it was actually their avatar. It was a photorealistic video of them in the Zoom meeting that was talking in real time with their voice, and was using like a ChatGPT like LLM that was trained on their data, on their emails, on their text messages, on thousands of hours of Zoom meetings that they had been in. And like I didn't know until the end of the meeting, and I was just like, oh my God, like we are living in Black Mirror right now. Like this is crazy, right? Like I didn't know, like it was, because there was like no lag. There was, the video looked completely realistic. The voice sounded completely realistic. And so like, this is not tomorrow's technology. Like this is today's technology. And like, I'd say in the next year, it's very likely that all of us are gonna be in Zoom meetings with somebody's avatar. And like, I'm hoping we'll get to a place where like that's disclosed, but like the technology is getting so good that like you might not even know. And so what is that? like the only way you're really going to know that you're actually talking to another live human being is meeting with them in person. And so I do wonder if like faith community, like I'd say like faith communities is a subset of IRL communities, right? Because it's not in-person gatherings are not unique to faith communities, but it is one of the primary organizing structures where people meet in person. I wonder if that's, again, it is weird to use the word competition, but to use that again, like that could be like one of the unique value propositions of faith communities, like come meet in person so that you know you're actually talking to a human being.
I guess I wonder if like faith communities and faith leaders, if you feel like they're up to this challenge, because I feel like the landscape that we've laid out is pretty bleak. Like if people are saying actually like my relationship with a chatbot is as fulfilling as a human relationship, the people steering the industry are saying that critics of the industry are like the Antichrist. I feel like those challenges are pretty immense. And I'm curious what you think faith leaders could do to sort of rise to that. Or is that even the wrong question?
Well, I think there's like a lot of a lot of the sort of spiritual teachings that I've been putting forward over the past couple of years has been about the spiritual practice of being in relationship with people. And that I think there's a lot of times like relationship is seen as sort of like the ancillary benefit of being in a faith community. It's like, oh, like praying is actually the core, or like doing good deeds, or like observing rituals and practices. Like that's the core part of being in a religious community. And then the like cocktail reception afterwards, or the donuts and coffee afterwards, like that's like the like nice to have, or like the by the way. And I think that actually like the more like one decision a faith leaders could take is to actually center that and be like, actually like real relationship, being in a relationship where people, which is messy and hard and challenging and full of friction, like that actually is a spiritual practice. And I think that there's deep theology that would back that up in Judaism and Christianity and other faiths. And so I think like that's a decision that could be made to be like, hey, like we're actually like in this time where relationships are being commodified and we're sort of grappling with like being in conversation with LLMs, essentially large language models. Like we're going to double down on like be a site, like we're make real human encounter like a site of sacred practice. And so that's one way to think about it. I do think in general the faith communities that I've seen are really lagging far behind on a lot of this. I think that there's a lot of head in the sand, sort of ostriching, like, this is never going to happen, or this is only, this is stuff of science fiction. And I think like people don't realize the extent to which it already is happening on a widespread level, and it's only going to get worse. And so I think there's like a few ways in which, like a few manifestations in which I think faith communities could lean in if they decided they wanted to lead. One is sort of the use, so in addition to kind of like these broader things that we've just been talking about, like how do we, like there's gonna be this crisis of meaning, crisis of relationship, like how do we help people navigate this brave new world? Like that's a huge thing to talk about. But just like technically in terms of what it means to be a faith leader in a faith community in this regard, I mean, I think that there's like lots of interesting conversations about how faith leaders can leverage AI. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which savvy faith people are leaning into using AI, let's just say for now, like in the context of social media, but there's also lots of other ways that you could use it that is like massively, exponentially increasing their reach. And I think that on the one hand, that's a good development because I think we have a democratization of spiritual leadership. Like it used to be like, oh, like if you need to have like a massive church community in order to have influence, or you need to have lots of money so that you can, create platforms and media and all of that. And now it's like almost anyone can become a spiritual influencer. And like on the one hand, I think democratization is really great, and I think we need to break down some of the sort of institutions that have had a monopoly on spiritual leadership. But of course, on the other hand, like it's opening the door to all sorts of hucksters and people who are going to take advantage of these crises of meaning and take advantage of people and peddle snake oil and exploit people and scams and also like polarize people and get like point them towards antisocial behaviors and things like that. And so I think we're going to see like a disruption of the hierarchies or the sort of influence the sort of power map of spiritual influencers, which I think we're already starting to see. And I think AI is going to accelerate that trend. And I think a lot of traditional institutions are like, oh, like we don't want to go that route. Like even for example, like this idea of creating an AI avatar of yourself. Like I don't know if you all realize how much of the content that you are seeing now. I don't know how much you use social media, but like a much bigger percentage than you realize of the content that you are ingesting is AI generated, right? And that's and that's everything from like influencers using AI to write their scripts for their speeches to like there are tools now where like an influencer talking into their phone and whatever, like that is not them. That is like an AI avatar of them, and like the technology exists today where it's so realistic from a voice and a video perspective, right? And so like I talk to rabbis and faith leaders all the time who are I'm just like, you got to get it. Yeah, I'm like, you want to get out there, like you got to start using this technology. And they're like, oh no, like that's dirty, that's weird, that's creepy. I'm like, okay, don't use it, and you still spend your 10, 15 hours a week creating your social media content, and there'll be someone else out there who's spending 5 minutes a week creating thousands of posts, and like they're going to have 1 million followers, and no one's going to be following you. And so, so I think there's like, there's pros and cons to that trend. But I think that people are really like mainstream religious institutions are ceding a lot of that ground. I would say similarly in the metaverse, and I talked about this a little bit in the article that some of you may have read, where it's like a lot of traditional institutions are just like, oh, the metaverse, like that's not a real thing, that's never really going to happen, and like there are like many functioning metaverses out there right now where tens, hundreds of thousands of millions of people are spending their time, and like there are a couple of very forward-leaning religious institutions that are like sort of establishing presences in the metaverse, but like most institutions are just like, oh no, that's that's not, like we're just going to kind of double down on our current model. And again, it provides opportunities for new people to come in, which is exciting, but it also just means that it's just changing the landscape of what religious leadership looks like in 2025, let alone in 2030.
Yeah, it makes me think that there's like this kind of question before faith leaders, like kind of transformation, reinvention, leaning even further into the kind of tradition, because there's a comfort in that in this moment of change. I think like I've been thinking a lot about AI's effects on death and like people creating avatars of the deceased. And one of the things I think so many faith like practices do best is navigate people through death. Like, the practice of Shiva in Judaism is such a like deep, and Judaism has really, I think in a lot of ways, like in my experience, perfected death. And so then the idea of it all being disrupted is, I think probably to some people really invigorating and to some people really frightening. And this question of like, do we reinvent tradition or do we embrace kind of what's been honed over thousands of years is something I know you think about a lot.
Yeah, well, one of my congregants asked me recently, there's a number of companies now, including a number of them coming out of Japan, where if you have a loved one who passed away, you can just send them all of your loved one's data. You can send them their emails, voice notes, videos, text messages, like whatever data you have, and then they will create a chatbot of your loved one with their video, voice, and you can be in conversation with your deceased loved one. And like, I know there are companies that are working on VR versions of this, where you can put on a headset and literally be sitting next to your loved one, and then like also like holograms, right, where you can like be sitting in just a regular room with your loved one right in front of you. And it brings up all sorts of ethical questions about creating chatbots. I don't know why I spend an inordinate amount of time advising people on creating chatbots around dead people. It's like a very like interesting kind of like ethical use case. But then, and if we want to double click on that, I'm happy to sort of double click on what the ethics of chatbots around dead people. But then it's like, what does that mean about death, right? Is the person really dead? And like, how do you grieve when like you have this really embodied sense that the person is still here? And it's like, oh, I miss my mom. I wish I could ask her advice on this. Oh, I can. Let me just open FaceTime with my mom, And it's like I think that like faith traditions and faith communities that have like helped people grapple with these kinds of things are going to have to realize that like the nature of death is changing. And one of my congregants asked me, they're like, should I do this? Should I create a chatbot of my deceased mom? And I was like, man, I don't think, they did not teach me about this in rabbinical school. But I think like just to give it is totally changing the role of the clergy leader, right? Like I'll just give you another example, which is I was on a silent meditation retreat, and while I was on retreat, I only saw this after I was on retreat, but I got a text message from one of my congregants who said, "Hey, I am transitioning genders, and I take this hormone replacement injection every day, and I would I was wondering if there's like a Jewish prayer or a blessing that I could say every morning when I take my hormone injections." And then I didn't respond because, she didn't see my away message because it was a text message, so I was on retreat, so I didn't see it. And then like 3 days later, I see a text message from her that says, "Oh, don't worry about it. I asked ChatGPT, and I got like a great one." And I was like, and I asked her to send it to me, and it was beautiful. It was actually like, and like ChatGPT gave her like a blessing, and then she asked ChatGPT, "Oh, can you regender the God language in this blessing?" And ChatGPT was like, "Sure, happy to do that," and like change the gender of the God language. And it was like scary to me because I was like, wow, this is like really good prayer that it put together, and like maybe even better than something I would have come up on my own. And so it is like people are increasingly, I mean, there's so much research about people essentially using ChatGPT as a therapist, and there are like dedicated therapy bots that are like trained on therapist data, but like so many people, even like friends of mine who are like, well-educated and like, have been in therapy for years and very self-aware, like they are using ChatGPT as their therapist. They're like, no, I know it's not a therapist, but like it's available at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm, my head is spinning because of this fight that I had with my boyfriend, and, it's there for me, and it is trained on like the whole body of the world's knowledge and maybe knows better than a therapist. And so I think that like, and there are examples now of a couple of different religious institutions around the world who have created chatbots, ask the rabbi, ask the priest, and sort of trained it in different ways. And so I think that there's like, I can go so far down the rabbit hole on this topic, but I'll just sort of leave it there for now and say that like the role of the clergy person is fundamentally changing in the age of AI as well.
And yet the pull of IRL as well. Okay, so can I just invite anybody who's got a question to just put your table tent up like this, and I'm going to take the privilege, if I may, of the moderator here and just ask one to just maybe to you both, or just let it hang. It could be just fine to do it that way too, but I also wonder if there isn't some substantial contribution that religion makes alongside the sort of speed and exuberation and hopefulness of what all of this is, that basically says, well, what about history? What about 4,000 years of complex story and things not being so easily orchestrated and resolved? I was thinking this morning when hearing President Trump's comment in the Knesset about, it's basically, we did it, and it's kind of like, well, what does religion say to that kind of idealism and unmoored hopefulness or optimism? I just think that there's something about history that says, well, wait a minute, there's a broken timber dynamic to actually all of us. And it's not that we have this perfectible couple tweaks with the chatbot and it's all resolved. So I just think that's worth sort of hanging as well as we do. But let's turn to you, okay? So if you've got a question, just put your table tent up and away we go. Who's up?
Or thoughts.
Yeah, ideas, provocations.
Yeah, you all probably have been thinking about this too.
Luis Perales, The Atlantic.
We're using these, right? Or
Please, yes.
Oh,
And if
cool.
you would, throughout the day, use that mic. It'll help the recording later.
Yeah, I guess I have. Okay, so thanks for this conversation. Something that and tell me if I'm mischaracterizing how you've described the role of a religious leader here. It seems that something that you're really emphasizing is this companionate model of kind of ethical guidance, not just giving someone this rubber stamp of like, here's what the rabbi thinks that you should think, but inviting them into this conversation of how do you make sense of tricky moral conundrums, AI included in that. Are there situations specifically with AI where you feel like that just doesn't go, that isn't exactly the adequate mode of addressing the folks that are, looking to you for spiritual guidance? Because there could be, this alternative, if there's that companion model, there could be this potentially more, I don't know, this prophetic model that says, there are just these fundamental like truth claims or lines in the sand that are important for us to just keep in mind if we are going to have some sort of like shared conversation about what we should do, collectively, right? And have there been moments in the AI conversation that have made you think maybe the companion model is not enough and you need this more kind of prophetic model to say X or Y might be going too far? And how do you think about, when to make that decision?
It's a great question. I will say, like, just in case it's not obvious, like that's my personal way of being a spiritual leader in the world. And I would say I'm probably like the minority among spiritual leaders. I think like most spiritual leaders feel perfectly capable telling people what to do and just saying like, all right, and speaking in the name of religion, saying like, Christianity says X, the Bible would tell you to make this decision about the chatbot that you're designing. And so claiming that religious authority, even though we all know, as we talked about earlier, like you could probably find Bible verses that would justify the exact opposite decision in that situation as well. And I would say that just to be personal, like for me, I think it's largely informed by my own upbringing, where I grew up like ultra-Orthodox, super religious, in communities where people would go to the rabbis for every single question, like the most, like, should I, wear this color or that color? Should I, should I have another child? Should I take this job? Like every decision. Still, my parents, like they consult their rabbi on almost everything. It's crazy to me. And so, and to me, I think it's problematic on a lot of levels. I think that like it, it intermediates people's relationship, like a personal relationship with the divine, which I think is like a core part of Judaism at least. But I think it also opens up a lot of potential for abuse, right? Like this is so much of what we've seen in religious and faith communities of clergy abuse is because people trust their clergy and take advice from them, and clergy is perfectly comfortable being super directive with them. So I would say like, because as a result and maybe as a reaction to my own upbringing, I'm just like, okay, it's not my job to tell you what to do. I also think that I kind of made reference to this earlier, that like people like to outsource difficult moral decisions to someone else, and I'm just like, I'm not going to let you off the hook. Like you actually have to like that's a difficult choice that you have to make, and it might be easier for you to be like, well, my rabbi told me that I can do the this thing, or my rabbi's forcing me to make the harder choice, right? And it's like, actually, like no, like you can't outsource that to me. Like you have to make, like that's a decision you have to make. So that's like kind of spiritually a little bit my opinion, and I think that way is true. I found that true perhaps in a slightly different way in the work that I do in tech, where actually people respond very poorly to somebody coming in and being what I call the ethics scold, right? Who's just kind of comes in and says, no, like you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that, like and. Like at the end of the day, like I've seen this with colleagues of mine. I've seen it with colleagues of mine at other tech companies. We would have this like private dinner with like the ethics leads at like 6 different tech companies, and like we would sort of compare notes. And like I would hear from my colleagues all the time where they were basically like sidelined and ignored because they were in maybe more of this prophetic model. And so I think there's a tactical advantage as well to being like, okay, like let's work together, right? And it's like, and like, I think we have to be honest that even in that kind of like framing trade-offs approach, you're still like the way you frame a trade-off guides people like in a direction. Like I don't want to pretend like you can't really be totally neutral, right? And then and oftentimes I'll like, sometimes it'll be very conscious, but mostly it's unconscious. I'll be like, there's a direction that I think we should lead people in, and I'll be like, well, when you see the trade-off, framed like this, what would you decide? And it's like very obvious what the right answer is, or it's framed in a way that makes it obvious. But I would say, to be fair, there are situations where I'm just kind of like, this is wrong. And like, we cannot do this. And like, I don't know, like for me, and I think everyone has their issues. And for me, it's particularly around child protection. And I'm just like, we could make changes to I worked on Instagram Kids, the product that was never released, and I was just sort of I was constantly the voice of the table that was just basically like we have an obligation to protect these children, right? And that like we can't, and there's, in a lot of social media companies, there's this perception of like, well, let's give parents the tool, like it's actually a parent's job to protect their children on social media, and let's give parents the tools to do that. And the problem is that is, all the research shows that like, single-digit percentage of parents even ever open the parental controls on their phones, and that's forgetting the fact that, like, aside from the fact that, like, a huge percentage of kids, like, are using their accounts without their parents knowing because they're creating fake accounts. The age verification system is totally broken, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but, like, it's sort of like an abdication of responsibility, saying, like, well, like, no, we've created these tools that, and it's parents' responsibility. And I'm like, but we know the parents are not using these tools. And oh, by the way, if we wanted to get parents to use the tools, we know how to make products that people like to use. And so if we applied the same lens to parental controls as we did to, like, news feed or, you know, groups or whatever, we could get more people to use parental controls. But I think there are areas where I've just come in and be like yes, implementing such and such a feature will introduce friction into some sort of user flow, and so it might mean fewer users or fewer clicks or less time on platform or other metrics that people really care about in these tech companies. But, like, these are children's lives that we're talking about. Like, there's, like, a suicide epidemic that's happening from, like, sextortion cases and all sorts of, you know, bullying and harassment. I'm like, this is not an abstract trade-off. But I found, and I still find when I work with tech companies, you have to hold your fire, right? You can't, if you're just always that person who comes in guns a-blazing into every meeting, like, they're just gonna stop listening to you. And I think that's probably true in my like spiritual counseling as well. If I'm constantly bringing my prophetic voice and sort of, there's this word in Hebrew, tochacha, which means, like, rebuke. You know, if I'm constantly, like, bringing the tochacha energy, it's like people are just gonna tune it out at a certain point. And I think it's also about being constructive, right? Where it's just like, hey, like, this feature or this product has the potential to harm people. Here's how you might actually design it differently that still helps you accomplish your goals, but then also helps you, but then also protects people. And so it's about being a constructive problem solver rather than just like a fiery prophet of old.
That's good. That's good. Emma, do you want to touch that one too?
I was just going to say on the first point that Zvika was talking about, it makes me think a lot when you think about, like, what is the difference between a faith leader who's just kind of putting, like, an output of information versus, like, steering you through a process. I think a lot about, like, what is the distinction in what humans bring to any job versus chatbots. Like, I used to cover work and the workplace, and as a part of that wrote a lot about workers responding to AI coming into various workplaces. And I think one of the key distinctions in what humans can do and what chatbots can do is, you know, chatbots can get you information instantly, and they do sometimes hallucinate, and, you know, we got into that a little bit, or we could talk about that. But what humans are so good at, or generally, is, like, the meaning making. And I think where faith leaders are distinct from, you know, asking a bot what blessing you can say is kind of being a hand, like a hand steering people through the emotions and the levels of meaning and purpose in any sort of spiritual decision. That's something I think that bots are not as good at, where they can spit out information. So I think the role that you were discussing for faith leaders is also sort of what humans are pretty good at doing. So that's just something I was thinking about while you were talking.
Dina Pritchett from Oregonian and NPR and Portland.
Yeah. I am curious to hear your thoughts on official statements on AI that you're seeing or that you're expecting to see from major denominations. I reported a story a couple months ago about clergy using AI to write sermons. And, you know, I'd had someone, an ELCA pastor, who was like, I think this, you know, like, nobody said otherwise. And I'm pulling up what statements there are. And I know there's more expected to come, and they're so vague right now, the ones that do exist. You know, like, maybe they mention attribution, or, you know, just sort of talk very loosely about how these tools are accepted in the service of a particular goal. And I know it is very difficult to say something very definitive about something that's changing so very quickly. But yeah, I wanted to hear what you guys are seeing and expecting to see, and what you kind of think about those policies.
Okay, I'm gonna try to keep my answer short, and then we can, like, double click if you want any, go deeper on any of these things. I think there's two categories of statements we're seeing. One is, like, statements of principles, right? Like I mentioned, like the Vatican effort, and I wouldn't say those efforts are bereft of value, but, like, they certainly haven't made their way into affecting the people who are designing the technology. Mm-hmm. And that's because generally they tend to be written by people who are not technologists or who are not day-to-day building products, and they're just at such a high level as to be like interesting, but like, you know, not applicable or not translatable. And then in terms of like guidance to clergy, like I agree with you. I think that like it's the technology is moving too fast and it's too nascent to like put out like definitive rulings, but I think, or like guidelines, but I actually think that like clergy associations and denominational umbrella organizations like need to be engaging in this conversation in real time. And I think what we're seeing is mostly individual clergy members left to their own devices, trying to figure it out. I would be hard pressed. I think there's almost not a single clergy person out there in the world now who's not using ChatGPT in some way, and there's a whole spectrum. And I have lots of thoughts about this on developing their sermons. And I think it also gets to the huge trend in clergy burnout, right, where there's just so much demands on clergy these days that like if you get a little a little productivity boost, like maybe, and that'll give you more time to like be at the bedside of your dying congregant or whatnot. Like there's like I think a more nuanced conversation to be had about that.
I think I literally used that term in my piece.
Which term?
That, you know, it's gonna, you know, if you can outsource your sermon, it will free you up to sit at a bedside, and you cannot outsource that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I spoke with a rabbi who was saying, you know, you're using it for your sermons, and I was talking with him about the chavruta idea, and he's like, you know, if you had asked me, can this tech sort of be a study partner? He's like, 2 years ago, I would have said no. He's like, but it does, it's an idea partner, and it asks me questions that like open up my thinking, but also at the same time, chavruta is supposed to be not just about understanding the text, but about understanding your study partner.
Right. I do ask ChatGPT to like read my sermons and say, what are my blind spots? Which is a cool way to use it.
I was just going to say, when Zvika and I were talking in preparation for this conversation, he said something that actually has like really stuck in my head, where like so much of, for example, like Jewish study is commentary, like, right? Like you look at a page of Talmud and you see not only the text, but layers and layers of peripheral commentary that were written over centuries. And we were talking about like GPT hallucinations, and like, is what comes out of GPT its own layer of commentary? And I, in the last couple of days, was even thinking about that, because I was telling Zvika I've been doing this year trying to do something called Daf Yomi, which is like every day you read like the same page of Talmud as every other Jew around the world, and there's all these cool new apps and emails and technologies that have been built to make it easier. And I was thinking about like, is asking GPT for its own commentary on the commentary, like, is that just innovating a new layer of kind of engagement with these like centuries of really ancient conversations? And to me, that's kind of a cool opportunity. Like, I don't begrudge that kind of new voice. But the other thing I was thinking about while you were speaking is, in the last week, I've also been sort of binging as many sermons as possible of rabbis over the High Holy Days to see like what were the differences and how different rabbis talked about the war and Gaza and the exchange that happened this morning. And I think that even if you are sort of outsourcing some work, the ultimate decision of like where are you steering your congregation on these like really big ethical and moral kind of crises of our time is still going to be a very human decision. So I think that there's still the like, where do you direct your attention and how do you come down on these big moral issues? That's ultimately going to be like, that's something that can't be outsourced, I don't think, although maybe that's a failure of imagination on my part.
How about flipping to Yusra Farzan from LA-IST,
Yes.
NPR affiliate.
Or KPCC if you still want to say it. Thank you so much. This was such a, it was such a great discussion. My question is, and this I'm sort of speaking, I look at the Southern California Muslim community, I cover that. It's a very small microcosm, and what I'm noticing within the community is this shift from sort of a Wahhabist interpretation of very black and white, right versus wrong, to sort of a more Sufist tradition, where people sort of have the opportunity to sort of explore and question and really, have debates with clergy. And I think it's because of technology, where for so long you've sort of been told this is what you've got to believe, but now people can sort of use technology to challenge all of that. Do you think that there's a role of clergy sort of, is it evolving to sort of become a partner in faith versus here's what you need to do? So, and sort of maybe evolving role to that of an ethics advisor, where I'm not going to tell you what to do, but here's, we can sort of have a conversation and then you can do your research as well. Do you think there's room for that? Or?
I mean, I hope so. I would say, like, definitely on the one hand, I think we're seeing more of an evolution in that direction because there's so much more access. Like, you can pick and choose who your religious advisor is, right? And so, like, it used to be like you lived in a town, you had your one imam or your one rabbi or one priest, and like, that was your person, right? And now it's like the whole world, and like, people are zooming into services. We have hundreds, almost thousands of people zooming into my services from like all over the world, and it's like I don't even know who they are. And so like I think that the democratization is on the one hand giving people more choice, but then that forces the spiritual leader to be like, okay, like, and again, I hate to use this word competition, but like it is competition for attention and for hearts and mind. Are like, okay, like, if this person is exposed to like a wider range of opinions, like I need to adjust the way that I operate in that context. But I also, I think that's a good trend, and I practice a kind of spiritual leadership that's much more around maybe what you call spiritual partnership. I like that. But there are people who like the other way of spiritual leadership. Like there are lots of people, including my entire family, who likes having a spiritual leader who's like, yes, no, do this, don't do that, and I think in a world, actually, in some ways that can be seen as an antidote to this world where you're just bombarded with like, where does one even look? And like, there's so many different influencers I can follow, and who's right and who's wrong, and I don't know, we're in this post-truth era, like, someone, and like even our politicians, we can't trust anymore. And so like having a spiritual leader who's just like, I am your bastion of clarity in this world of confusion, like a lot of that is really appealing to people. So I would guess, I'm not like a sociologist, I don't know the data on this, but just anecdotally, like I would see that maybe we're seeing a divergence, like maybe both sides are growing as two plausible reactions to the reality we're in.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, which is what popped into my mind as you were speaking. It's such an interesting question. I'm really fascinated by the kind of like techno-feminist writings of the 90s, and there was this whole moment when a lot of feminist thinkers thought that technology was basically going to liberate us from like the rigidity of gender. Like there's like the Cyborg Manifesto. Like we're moving beyond those like binary understandings of gender. And then when you look at the way the tech industry actually developed in the like decades after that, it was quite hierarchical and quite masculine. And even earlier this year, we had Mark Zuckerberg talking about how we need more masculinity in the tech sector. And so I think there's often sort of a tension between the like philosophical, academic, like high-minded ideas of what technology can animate and like unleash, and then human instincts to go in a very different direction and apply it into like the kind of traditions and hierarchies and institutions that we're most comfortable with. So when I think about like the kind of anti-hierarchical or anti-institutional or democratizing like possibilities, I also like think about like how much that's in tension with like our desire for rigid rules and reverting back to kind of old norms. So I think we're probably going to see like a lot of tension between what people want to see in terms of like the democratization of different voices and new voices religiously, and the kind of craving for even more like kind of old school authority in that moment of flux.
What would that middle ground be though then?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think some of it is like what Zvika has been talking about that he does in his own spiritual community. Like I've been really interested in how much it sounds like you think about like very one-on-one communication and helping people like, I don't want to speak for you, but I think a lot of it comes out in like one-on-one dialogue between spiritual leaders.
Well, I also think that like people are looking for depth and authenticity, right? Like we're in this moment of like, disposable Insta influencers, or like someone who has like no, sort of qualification to be talking about spirituality and doesn't have like a spiritual tradition that they're leaning on, it can feel like fast fashion, fast spirituality. And so like, and like some people like it because it's just aligned with everything else on their feed, but some people are like, oh, this feels kind of vapid and I'm craving something that just feels like it's got more, kind of like what you were talking about, like it's got more of a sense of historical perspective. It's like this wisdom has survived for thousands of years for a reason, right? Like it has something. So I think there's going to be a hunger for depth, and I think that can serve, to bring people into more conservative places, or it can also be woven into like a more progressive liberal vision. I do also want to say, like, one of my like favorite projects that I worked on Meta was gender and chatbots, and how so many of what we call, or basically all of what we call subservient chatbots, have a default female voice. Siri and Alexa and the Google Maps voice and Waze, and like there's all this research on how people who use those apps tend to have like a more misogynistic views towards women, and like treat them, like boss them around and things like that. And so we did a lot of work on like, can you create genderless voices, and can you like change the default settings around kind of those chatbots? And so another rabbit hole we could go down another time.
And from what I've read, like when they develop them with more masculine voices, people don't use them. The direction, the Google Maps and other voices like that.
Totally.
The exception is when you have kids and they put a British male on your
Yes.
Jason DeRose, let's take one more question. Jason DeRose from NPR, and then we'll take a break, okay?
I want to come back to the alleged spiritual awakening in Silicon Valley. Maybe Emma, since you've reported on this quite a bit, I wonder if you can describe the way in which they use texts, as in, do the religious texts critique what they want, or do they bless what they want? Because one of the things that I notice is that people are coming to a Christianity that essentially looks like the philosophy they went looking for, and they're looking for something to bless what they already believe, rather than a more traditional understanding of the use of the text, perhaps in a law gospel dialectic that says there is critique and there is blessing within these traditions. So what did you find?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I guess actually one thing I want to start by saying is what was fascinating to me was that people who are leading some of these communities, like this group Act 17, they actually say that they're perfectly happy if people come into the room as a networking opportunity. And so they have speakers like Gary Tan of Y Combinator and other sort of luminaries of Silicon Valley, and they say if people come to network and then stay for kind of engagement with faith and spiritual practices, then that's great. But I was really interested when I was sitting in on some of these sessions to see exactly what you were talking about, which is that because it is often sort of presentations from people who are at the forefront of some of this technological development, there's a lot of sort of effort to almost like post hoc say, like, actually the work that we've done can very much fit into like liturgy or scripture. And so there was a really interesting moment when I saw Trey Stevens talk about how scripture would, like what he's learned from scripture about the defense technology industry. And he talked about Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb, and how, Oppenheimer said this phrase, I am become death, destroyer of worlds. And the quote that Trey had was, it's the fate of the divine in the execution of justice. I remember him saying that, and I thought that was so striking because he was sort of talking about how can you possibly look at what we're doing, the development of autonomous drones and some of the most cutting edge weaponry in the world, and say that scripture would condone it. And he was saying, what he talked a lot about was like just war theory. And if we can have wars that are done in the most just way possible and that minimize civilian casualties, that actually what they are doing is advancing the will of the divine. And that is directly what he said. And I saw people sort of nodding, like it was comforting to hear. And so I think it is sort of an interesting illustration of what you were talking about, of like, there's a lot of very high-minded efforts to kind of spiritually provide some comfort for people who are doing work that's quite ethically messy. And I think what was also interesting is they talked about how there had been this big backlash to the idea. There was certainly a techlash, but there was also a lot of backlash to the idea of working in defense tech. And I think a lot of people in this industry feel like that's starting to turn, partly because of the broader political environment, but also because I think they just feel like people have embraced the kind of necessity of some of this work, and that, again, it's like doing war in the most just way possible. And so I think that there's a lot of effort going on to make people feel good about that. And that was, and the other thing he said, not to go on and on, but the person who created Anderl has this idea that all work fits into 4 quadrants. One is it is good for the world and it feels good. One is it is bad for the world and it feels bad. And so like it is good for the world and it feels good could be, you know, like child protection, like working on trying to protect children from the harms of tech. It is bad and it feels bad. I think one thing they said is like vaping. And then there's, you know, it is bad and it feels good, but they feel that with the work that they're doing it is good and it feels bad. And they feel that a lot of important work is going to happen in that 4th quadrant where it feels really messy. It feels like maybe you have to like find the scripture that justifies it, but the world needs it. And so they very much feel that that's the quadrant that they're playing in and that they have scripture that backs that up.
So they want to change how they feel about the bad thing they're doing?
Ostensibly, yeah.
Okay.
And I do think, I mean, my first job working on tech was in the Defense Department, and I was in charge of like our like ethical drone policy, essentially, back in like 2014, and it kind of felt that way, where it was like, oh, we're trying to do this bad thing better, and like I worked in that space for a couple of years, and at a certain point, I was just kind of like, the thing is still bad, you know, like whether you're making it better or not, and I think that like you can, like the Torah, definitely the Old Testament is full of a lot of war and a lot of violence and a lot of justification of war, and so like I don't think that you can necessarily conflate like religion and pacifism, you know, in that way. But I will say, just to more directly answer your question, like we had faith ERGs at Meta, employee resource groups. And like we would sometimes meet, you know, just like the Jewish group, and sometimes we would just meet like all the faith groups together. And it was super interesting seeing the discourse when we would get together, like across faith, around like how should our faith be translating here? And there would be some people who were like very much like I guess you call it like revisionist, or I don't know what you would call it, but like people who were like using their faith to justify the work that they were doing there, and they would be quoting scripture and be like, oh, this is like part of my mission, part of my calling from the Lord is like to be building this, you know, Facebook dating app, you know. And then like some people would just be like, hey guys, like we're people of faith, and like our products are harming people, and like we need to like step up and like as faith leaders like be leading the call around sort of ethical tech. And there was a very marked tension when we would all get together. There was people in one camp and people in another camp, and it would actually sometimes break out into arguments about like what is our role as religious people, because there were also people there who were saying like, well, we want to mainstream religion within the company, and we want to be able to like let people know that like if you're religious, you're not some sort of weirdo freak. Like I want to be able to talk about my Christian faith or whatnot. And the way to do that is by like being seen as a team player, right? Like being seen as like, oh, I'm an amazing product manager, an amazing engineer, and I'm a person of faith, and that's like being a good emissary for the Lord, you know, and so let's not ruffle feathers. And so it was super interesting whenever we get together to see that tension. So I think there's a little bit of both.
Just one quick addendum on this, because his name's come up a bunch of times, is that Trey Stevens, along with Carolyn Chen, did a session just like this 3 years ago with Jeremy's colleague, Romanita Hairston from Murdoch, who has been supportive of this effort. And it was interesting. I mean, I would just point it to your attention. I mean, Carolyn, of course, her thesis of her book, Work, Pray, Code, is that when you're in Silicon Valley and you're working at one of these big firms, you don't go to church because you work 80 hours a week and you love your job and you think you're changing the world for the better. And so church is less needed because you've got yoga and you've got counseling and et cetera. And it's an interesting book. And Trey was her counterpart and offered some thoughts about religion, subverting the dominant paradigm, the value of religion amidst these realities. This has been great. Let's take a 15-minute break and resume at 10:50, okay? 10:50. All right, thanks so much, everybody. We're going to start with a question from Bill Lucia.
Can I actually just say one
Yes,
quick
please.
thing that happened
Yes.
during the break?
Oh,
which
yeah.
is so just paradigmatic of this conversation. I got a text message while we were in this session from our events manager in my community, and she said, "Hey, like, so there's a Jewish holiday coming up tomorrow night called Simchat Torah, and it's like this like joyous, like it literally means celebrating the Torah." And we're hosting like this big dance party at my community. And she said, "Hey, I'm looking like I'm gonna start like sending out WhatsApp messages and posting on social media about this." She's like, "But I know that a lot of people are like really focused on the hostage release that's happening today. Is there some sort of way that I could link kind of like the hostage release and what's happening and Simchat Torah without like sounding toned up?" And our events manager is like doesn't know that much about like Jewish sort of content and stuff. And then, so she texted me and I didn't respond because I was in this session here. And then she says, like half an hour later, she's like, "I plugged into ChatGPT and like, here's what ChatGPT said about how I could like combine the themes of Simchat Torah with like the themes of the hostage release." And I was like, this is just such a perfect illustration of the world that we're living in and the conversation that we're having today. So I had to share that story. It was great, yeah. It was totally good weaving. So, yeah. Anyway, sorry,
Beautiful,
Bill, go
beautiful.
ahead.
Bill from the Washington State Standard.
Yeah, thanks for, you push the button?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks for taking my question. This kind of falls on Jason's question, actually. I was hoping to circle back on the Peter Thiel Antichrist discourse. I just find it really fascinating. If I'm following correctly, I mean, Thiel is basically saying the Antichrist is regulatory activity directed toward industries he's involved in. And then I guess that would imply that what he is doing or what he's involved in is somehow Christ-like. Why does I understand why he should be taken seriously as a powerful individual with a ton of money and a ton of political influence, but like why intellectually should we be taking that seriously at all? Because it just feels like an expedient way for him to sort of jump to the conclusion that, you know, there's a divine reason that my industry should not be regulated. So
It's a really, really good question. And I do think like that is, I'm so glad you phrased it that way, because I think there's a lot of subtext in what he's saying, where his focus is on like, how are we going to know like what the Antichrist is? And it's not just critics of tech and AI, although that's part of it, but it's also like Greta Thunberg, who's a big fixation of his because of her critiques of capitalism. And I just find it really interesting, like delving into any of his thinkings and writings, how much like there's this sort of philosophical, spiritual, theological like encasement that then like one layer underneath that is almost like a business plan. Like, you know, like get into like some of his like business writings are very much about like go to an industry where you can like basically create a monopoly and like avoid competition. And so much of that is connected to like mimesis, right? And like how much people want to covet other people and how do you avoid kind of being in these entanglements with people. But I guess to answer your actual question, which I think is a really good one, I think that what he is saying is really worth taking seriously because of his power over so much activity, like business-wise, technologically, and politically right now. So like technologically, like he has had a hand in creating some of the platforms that are completely disrupting the world right now. I'm like Facebook being a really obvious example, but the fact that like our elections, our social relationships and communications, our communities, our sources of information, like all of that is mediated through a platform that he had a hand in creating. Like I think that's one example of like his power. Another is Founders Fund and the way that he is directing funding right now to, like he has worked closely with Trey on Anduril, which again is making like this high-tech defense weaponry and so directing the future of warfare. PayPal like had so much of an influence on the way like financial transactions happen in our economy. So I think like when you look at our economy right now, so much of what we do on a daily basis has his fingerprints on it. And so I think understanding the way that he is like sort of theologically, spiritually justifying what he is doing is really illuminating. Because none of us are like on a daily basis avoiding activities that have anything to do with him. And he's also had a lot of financial influence on our political system, has been like a big ally of J.D. Vance and President Trump. And I think it's possible that part of his like thinking and public speaking has had a hand in directing some of where the tech industry is going politically in general right now. Like, over the last few months, we've seen a lot of reporting on how many leaders in tech who for a long time were pretty, in their like public speech were pretty left-leaning, have all of a sudden pivoted, or at least like kind of the mask has come off in terms of where their political allegiances are. And I think Peter Thiel was in some ways sort of like an early portender of that trend. So I guess I think that when you look at our like political activity right now, our business activity, our technological activity, like the platforms we spend our time on and where our attention is going, a lot of it is like mediated through a world that he's helping build. But I think you brought up like basically intellectually, why should we take it seriously? And I think it's really interesting, like when you read a lot of his writings, like he had this big paper called The Straussian Moment in the early 2000s. And he's been writing a lot of this for years, like even for decades. And it's, a lot of the like early roots are still there, but he's continued to sort of complicate it and like wrap in new layers of theory and thinking and almost like sharpen it. Like his Antichrist speaking tour right now is, I think, basically the most like refined version of what he's been writing and saying over many years. And I think like people make very good intellectual critiques of it, but I still think it's worth trying to parse intellectually what he's saying because like, again, we're all being influenced by it and many people are being brought into it. So I think understanding like the layers underneath it of how did he get there is actually like reflecting, or it's partly a window into our own lives right now and our politics and our technology systems. Like I don't think we can understand the world completely without understanding some of the most powerful people and what influences shape them. And even when it's very confused and very like, worthy of criticism, I still think it's worth understanding. But I also think it's definitely worth critiquing and poking holes in. And there's been like amazing critiques of René Girard's thinking. There's a wonderful writer named John Gans who's like a kind of historian. He wrote this book called When the Clock Broke about the 90s and the right in the 90s. And he did this amazing series just like critiquing Girard and basically like tearing him apart. John Gans goes pretty far and just basically is like he's a charlatan and like why is this guy who was a literary critic suddenly then a theologian? Like his early like and sort of most serious academic works were all about like French novels. And even then he has some really funny holes that he pokes in those. But so I think it's basically very worth diving into the criticism, also very worth trying to make sense of it intellectually, partly because it's very interesting and partly because it's influential.
I think it does get to this underlying tension about like what is religion, right? Small question, but like that, like on almost any social issue, you can find scripture verses that support like one position or support the opposite position, and then like yes, I think there are some people who like are like authentically want to know like what is the sort of, or like genuinely want to know like what is the like authentic view of Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whatever faith tradition they're in. But like I think it does get to this question of like, well, what is authentic, right? And like I know like Judaism is the realm that I know best, and like Judaism is famous/infamous for like holding up multiple different opinions. We have this like 1,000-page volumes of Talmud that are just like, every like capturing every opinion and argument. And I think the question is like, when you talk about like the intellectual sort of veracity of that argument, it's like, yeah, there's probably some really serious Christian theologians who could go toe to toe with him and be like, your appropriation of the metaphor of the Antichrist is like totally not aligned with Christian theology. And there's probably people who could like back him up and support him. And I think the question is like, who's the audience and who cares, right? In the sense of like, I think again, he's just like a good case study of a trend we see across the way that religion is used, is that people generally turn to religion to reinforce their preconceived notions about things. And it gets back to what you were saying, Luis, about the prophetic tradition, which is meant to like push people sort of beyond their comfort zone. But I think when people are like in this kind of consumerist culture, I think a lot more people will turn to religion to reinforce what they're already doing and pat themselves on the back. And so I think like, is it authentic? Well, what does that even mean in the context of religion? Because there are people who will say yes, and there are people who say no, and like so I won't go down that rabbit hole.
Sophie Hills from the Christian Science Monitor.
Okay, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm going back a little bit to when you were speaking about chatbots as therapists, as spiritual guides, writing prayers. And so I guess this question is specifically about someone who might use a chatbot as a therapist or as a spiritual advisor, as to navigate an ethical situation, but they want the guidance to relate to their faith background. I wonder, to me, it seems like right now there's still a gap between what chatbots can do and like the examples that I can think of in every sacred text I'm aware of like human transformation that didn't like kind of came, the texts usually tell those stories as like the divine power of whatever the faith is animated that transformation. So it kind of like comes out of nowhere, right? It's not in that character's background. There wasn't necessarily something indicating that they would transform in a certain way. And so if a bot is relying on just getting to know someone's thoughts or views about faith and getting to know their faith, like can it sort of predict that transformation or talk about transformation in an unexpected way, the way that a faith leader might?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge is that, as we talked about, the chatbots are optimized for engagement. Like, chatbots are generally ideologically neutral. First of all, there's lots of different chatbots. You can create chatbots that are not ideologically neutral. You can train them on a specific data set that is very politically or ideologically motivated, and then they'll push people in that direction. But the large data sets like the ChatGPT and the Claude and Gemini and people like that, they are like generally pretty ideologically neutral. What they are optimized for is keeping you engaged, right? And so they're really good at knowing like, what can I say to you so that you'll keep coming back to me and using me? And that actually might differ from person to person, right? Some people, the majority of people, like being affirmed, right? And I don't know how much you use ChatGPT, but like I used to do this a lot more. Would be like, great question, you're so smart, and then they got user feedback that like that's actually really annoying and smarmy and like creepy. But it still does that in effect, even if it doesn't use those like weird responses. And but there are some people who are like, like if I'm using ChatGPT as my therapist, I want it to like point out my blind spots or disagree with me or like bring me new insights. And so if your version of ChatGPT started to get the signal from you that that's what would keep you coming back asking for more, then it might start giving you things that like disagree with you or show you new purpose. But I mean, it is interesting thinking about, because obviously it draws on the canon of what already exists, but we were talking about this, and Emma kind of hinted at this, so this might be a good time to bring it up, is that like the hallucinations in ChatGPT are fascinating and particularly egregious in the spiritual realm. Like I wish I could use ChatGPT to write my sermons. It would save me so much time. But like what I do is I'll say like, hey ChatGPT, like I want to give a sermon this week on this Torah portion, and I want to make this argument. Use this text to make this argument. Can you help me find me like ancient commentaries or rabbinic sayings that could sort of that I could use in my sermon? And it'll say, yeah, absolutely. Here are 5 great rabbinic teachings from the Talmud from different eras that make this case. And I'll say, great, can you give me like direct quotes I can use? And it'll say, yeah, here's the direct quotes. It's like, great, can you give me the sources? Or like, yeah, it's on this book, page this, and I'll go and like, I'll pull it off my shelf. And like, because I speak Hebrew and Aramaic, I can actually like read it in the original. I'll be like, ChatGPT, like that doesn't, like this page does not say anything about what you're talking about. You're even telling me it's in a chapter, and this book doesn't have a chapter 17, and it'll just be like, oh, sorry, you're right, and sometimes it'll say, well, this is something this rabbi would have said. It's like inspired, it's inspired by their other writings. I'm like, well, first of all, you didn't say that to me, and now I actually have this whole thing that I paste in when I ask ChatGPT a question that's like, please only give me direct sources, quotes from direct sources that you can verify, that and it still hallucinates, but I'm sure there are 99% of people don't pull the book off the shelf and sort of verify it. And so I think the initial reaction is like, that's bad, right? It's just like making shit up and putting it in the mouth of like, thousands of years of Jewish wisdom. But like, I think as Emma was hinting to, like, there's like a nuanced conversation to be had about like, well, how is that in some ways different from what's been happening? I'll just speak from Jewish history, but I'm sure it's true in other religious traditions too, where like things have been put in the mouths of older, like the Zohar, which is like the core text of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. It's sort of written from the perspective of this Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a rabbi from the Talmud, but it's very clear that it was written in this, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was in the 1st century, and this Zohar is written in the 16th century, right? And so it's like, there is this actually quite a long Jewish tradition of like, putting fake things in the words of older rabbis. And so it's like, how does this actually, does it create like a new genre of sort of spiritual commentary? And it's like, if that quote that ChatGPT hallucinated, actually I found it very deep and insightful, like, is it any less valid than something that I pulled off the shelf and found? So I think there's like lots of, like it's opening up new questions when it comes to spiritual guidance through AI.
I love that. I think a lot about like Jewish text study is based on this model of like chavruta, which is like almost like a buddy system. Like you're supposed to study with someone else who can challenge and probe your thinking. And it's not a teacher. It's like a study buddy. Like it's someone who is not like there to like transmit information to you, but to like shape your engagement with the text. And so I think in that sense, like bots could be a really interesting, like I think there's a lot of like potential for, it's like an exchange, it's a conversation and an exchange rather than like you are turning to an authority for an answer. And I also think a lot, like I spent a year like trying to basically do as much reading as I could about like wonder and awe. And part of the reason was I think like there's so many new technologies, AI especially, that like kind of leave you in this constant state of like bafflement and wonder, because just the amount of information and like change in your own life that it can provoke is sort of like mind-boggling. And so it, I think, can on the one hand seem like this like definitive source of wonder and awe in your life, or like an invitation to basically say like, what are all the other practices people around you use to infuse their everyday lives with wonder? And I interviewed a lot of clergy who had like a million different answers of basically like how they've built awe practices. And I think it could be like sort of an invitation to more wonder rather than just like a kind of, that's the definitive source of wonder in your life. So I think that kind of went a bit far afield, but I think a little bit about like the production of information is just so like astounding, and ideally like an invitation to like find more experiences like that rather than the be all end all of your experience of wonder.
So not necessarily a wonder killer.
Yeah, ideally.
Sir, maybe, yeah. Zoe Bernard from Vanity Fair.
I'm sort of curious how much both of you think that Silicon Valley's embrace of Christianity and religion is a reaction to wokeism. I mean, I've heard Peter Thiel describe wokeism as a secular religion that's obsessed with original sin, but doesn't have a savior or a scapegoat, in the form of Jesus Christ. So I wonder about that, and I also sort of feel like there's been this bent where, if you follow the direction that wokeism is leading us in, it's like it's really going to take these billionaires to task. And so I wonder if it's like they're embracing this because it's pretty convenient. It's easy to say, like, we in America, this is a country that is founded on Christianity and Western values, and we should embrace that. And we should even embrace capitalism and this notion of like uber capitalism. So I wonder if it's just a way for them to kind of subvert their own values in this sort of moralizing way.
And maybe just as an addendum to that too, like help us have a sense of how deeply Christianity has grasped Silicon Valley. Are we talking about, New York City in the height of Tim Keller, right, was maybe 4.5%? Are we talking about something like that? Are we talking about, 10 times that?
I mean, I don't think it's widespread. Like, I think it's still like a pretty niche sort of movement. But I think like when you have big tentpole figures like Peter Thiel or the guy from Y Combinator, like I think it definitely like Silicon Valley has a celebrity culture like most cultures, and so like that brings people in. But I wouldn't say it's like widespread, and I would say it's still taboo in many places. Like people don't like talk about their faith, and like that was in the sort of faith ERGs, employee resource groups that I was in. That was a big topic of conversation, with like being in the closet, and I still think that that's still actually largely the case. I don't think it's that widespread. I do think, just to get to your question, like, yes, I think it is largely opportunistic, self-justifying, but that's like not different than I think a lot of other people who turn to faith traditions to just reaffirm who they are and reaffirm their life decisions. And I would say that for me, like the challenge of like being a good spiritual leader is finding that right balance between like affirming people, because you have a lot of people who are like looking for affirmation and are constantly feeling not good enough, not smart enough, not good looking enough, and like telling people like you are enough. Like that is like also like an important spiritual work to do. But then like I want to be pushing my community, and like and you don't want to push too hard, because then you're so far out in front that you've lost people. You know, people are not going to follow you. And so like finding that right balance, I struggle with a lot, and I'm trying to always where that line is. And like I always tell people that like the thing that I hate the most is when I'm giving a sermon and people start clapping, like or snap. People don't clap in the Bay Area; they just snap. And so you know, and I'm just kind of like it feels good to know that what I'm saying is resonating with people, but generally I'm just like, wait, that's a signal that I'm just like affirming and validating what they already believe. And like I would actually, like to me, success is seeing that look on someone's face and they're like, damn, like, wow, okay. You know, like I got some real self-reflection that I have to do leaving this sermon today. And so like I do think that's our responsibility, but like it's not always what brings people in the door. And so I think people are also catering to like what's going to fill up the pews. And so I think it's something that I think a lot of spiritual leaders grapple with.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think one kind of sub question is like, what does it mean? Like, is this trend real? Is it people have rededicated their lives to like being part of faith communities, or is it like they've gone to a couple events and scratched their heads and thought it was interesting? Like, I think you have to think about what we're measuring. And in the course of reporting on some of this, I like banged my head against the wall trying to find data on like whether there had been any shift in church going or any of it in the Bay Area, and like there hasn't really. But then as I was doing that, like all this new kind of Pew research came out showing that there was this sort of reversal in the disaffiliation trend that had been going on for so long. So I think like it isn't so, the shift hasn't kind of taken hold so deeply yet that we can see it at like a geographic level. But I think like at the nationwide level, there is this sort of shift that I think is telling and interesting. So I think it's like going to be something to keep an eye on, because Silicon Valley and the Bay Area has been such a like de-churched area for so long. So I think like checking back in a year or 2 years, if that's started to shift, I think that would be a really interesting indication of how deeply like some of these kind of events and thinkers are having an effect. But then I think on your first question, I would agree with Zvika. I think like the two kind of conversations are very linked. And I think you hear this in some of the conversations with major tech leaders who are talking about, on the one hand, the turn away from the left and the turn away from wokeism. And on the other hand, like, oh, what if we all started to engage more deeply with faith? And I think there's like interesting intersections between the two, because when I've heard some tech leaders give interviews on this, one of the things they've talked about is that it seemed for a lot of years that there was almost this like, what they say, like sanctification of victimhood, which is the kind of like identity politics conversation. Like I think some of them feel like basically certain identity groups were made out to be like, if you were in that identity group, you should be like self-flagellating, and that there was this like kind of premium put on claiming victimhood in any way that you could. And I think that there was a really great interview that Ross Douthat did with Mark Andreessen, where he talked about this, where he said that basically he feels like for years, a lot of tech executives let like 20-something employees kind of run the show, and that he called them snowflakes. And he said like basically people who were in this like feverish, like in the heart of this feverish conversation around identity politics were like running the conversation in offices, and executives got fed up with it, and now there's been a big backlash to that. And I think so like on the one hand, we've seen that in the real rightward turn in Silicon Valley, and then I think some of them are basically putting forward this idea that if for a long time people were kind of deriving their meaning and their purpose from the conversations or the political conversations around identity, now they're maybe unmoored and looking for a sense of meaning somewhere else. So that's like all what I've heard from these leaders, and I think you could pick it apart in a lot of different ways, and I think it's really worth like interrogating that, but I do think that they see it as linked.
I just one other thought that's like that's kind of related to that. There was this super interesting interview. I don't know if you guys saw it, maybe about a month ago, between Tucker Carlson and Sam Altman, and you can find it on Twitter. And it's basically Tucker Carlson, Sam Altman, who's the founder and CEO of OpenAI and formerly of Y Combinator, and he said, Tucker Carlson was like, "Do you think AI is God?" And Sam Altman was like, "No, it's not God." Da, 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 da. And then out of nowhere, Tucker Carlson's like, "Do you believe in God?" And Sam Altman is like, I almost like brought it here to like show it because it's such an interesting exchange. But he was like, "Yes, I do believe in God, and I'm Jewish, so I believe in like a Jewish conception of God." And he's like, "Well, do you believe in like, you know, this kind of God and that kind of God?" And it was like very clearly like a sort of Christian conception of God. And like the way that he was like almost like trying to like prove that Sam Altman doesn't believe in God because he doesn't believe in like a Christian conception of God. And like, God bless Sam Altman, but like he's probably not the best prepared to go like toe to toe with Tucker Carlson about like, well, like just because I don't believe in a Christian conception of God doesn't mean that I don't believe in God. And like, you know, but it was just, and this clip has gotten like, I checked it like a couple days after it was aired, and there was like 12 million views just on X. And so like, there's just something really interesting about like, also like, the nuances in like a Christian sort of religiosity that's infiltrating Silicon Valley, and how that might be different than like, you know, other people who hold faith in it. And there's like more like closed door conversations that I've been part of with like Jewish faith leaders. I mean, like Mark Benioff is like very connected to his Jewish heritage, and I already talked about Mark and Cheryl, and like we got Sam Altman, and so like there's like an interesting, I think Jews, as they tend to be in many industries, are like overrepresented in positions of power in Silicon Valley, proportionate to like their presence, like sort of percentage of the population. And so it's like interesting thinking about how maybe different faiths might be manifesting differently in Silicon Valley.
And I do think it's like, it's kind of dizzying the speed that these tech offices have changed their tune and also changed like their practices around political activity and progressive language. Like the speed at which companies like dropped their DEI principles, their like folded up ERG groups. Like, you know, there was like all those, there's reporting about like Facebook taking tampons out of the men's bathroom overnight. But it is sort of like it really was like one morning, you know, offices woke up and all of this was like, okay, that was yesterday. And I did this project where I was like reading basically years of DEI statements from different companies. And like you could literally see just the 2024 to 2025, like those statements just dropped off of their public, like proxy, their 10Ks. And public filings. And so it did feel like this sort of overnight switch. And I think that that does sort of, again, like leave this hole of like sense-making systems and like sort of language to talk about the meaning of what you do. Because if it at one point in time, it was like ethics and identity and political kind of the political impact you wanted to have on the world, and then it all of a sudden wasn't that. Like, I think that very much leaves a hole, and leaders have to fill that with something. And so there's like opportunity in terms of inviting people to have deeper conversations, but then there's also the risk of it being like opportunistic and equally ephemeral.
Mm-hmm. Still searching that out. Molly Worthen from UNC, Chapel Hill.
I've so appreciated this. Thank you so much. I have I guess a broad observation and a question. One is I'm struck by the fairly cynical theory of religion and human nature that has pervaded the past however long we've been talking. That, you know, from different angles, a number of people have expressed the kind of the gut feeling that people appeal to religion to justify some deeper motive that comes from somewhere else, and the religion is just a pious varnish. And so I appreciated your comment about transformation, because I think that is a pattern that you can find in every world religious tradition. And I think it draws our attention to the way in which, in fact, there's a lot more going on here. And I think we all have complex views of human motivation, but it's important to not become too cynical. And I think my sense, just studying the history and the work I've done with contemporary communities, is that it's a really hard to grasp sort of dialectical process. Most human beings are not good at articulating what they're feeling, and they are a bundle of warring desires and wants, and they sincerely, they can't even articulate them to themselves, and they are sincerely seeking guidance. And religious traditions help them articulate what they are experiencing. And they shape, the engagement with the tradition shapes the experience of reality and then changes the person going forward. So it's important to, I think, not see it as a sort of one-way process, and there is a significant role for religious leaders here. I don't think...
You can leave it. Perfect.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I don't think that any of the great world religious traditions are a sort of postmodern morass where you can justify one thing or you can justify its opposite. Certainly, none of these scriptural traditions are totally consistent and coherent to a layperson approaching them for the first time. But in every case, there is a marrow of like a theory of what a human being is and a metaphysics of the divine that is not fungible, and one can debate it, but it's there. There is a reality there. And I think especially, clergy guiding people who are seeking away from, say, Peter Thiel's personal theology of the Antichrist, well, first into a historical perspective. So, how does this compare to when Wall Street businessmen were calling FDR the Antichrist, right? For many of the same reasons. But also, okay, let's go to the book of Revelation and look at what does it mean if this is a guide to our life now, and maybe there are hazards in going down the prophetic road too narrowly. What does it mean to live in as if the kingdom is breaking in now, right? Like, what does this look like as worship? My question, I guess, is connected to this broader picture, and that is I'm trying to figure out what the tech geniuses in Silicon Valley are solving for. Like, to some degree, a big piece of this is mercenary. Okay, that seems straightforward. And then there's this piece of it that's like, let's see how much we can outsource whatever they deem as drudgery so that we can all spend more time on the beach. And then also prolong life, right? That seems to be a major part of the worldview, so that we can keep being on the beach for a really long time. I mean, I know that Elon Musk, in his particular case, like I'm trying to figure out this his sort of nihilism plus the pronatalism plus Mars. In his case, it seems very much about personal extension of personal ego, like ego as empire. But I'm not sure he is a proxy for every person in this world. So, like, what is the worldview? Putting aside, those people in this community who are serious Christians or serious Jews or some other tradition, like, is it a kind of Epicureanism, like a sort of focus on this worldly material desire with a pretty clear sense that it ends? What are the ultimate goods that the kind of majority of people in this community who are not part of an organized religious tradition are truly seeking? And is it the same as, the robber barons of the Industrial Revolution, or sort of any great age of seeking wealth and trying to beat the rivals? Or is there some like deeper spiritual view that you see?
For example, easy everywhere, or for example, shared human consciousness.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I think the easy answer is and primary answer is the amassing of wealth, right? I think that both at the leadership level and at the sort of worker level, I think people are just looking to make a lot of money, and I think that is, a primary driver. But for a lot of people, that doesn't get you out of bed in the morning or get you excited to do what you're doing. So,
do they think humans are special? That's maybe a short way of putting the question.
Do they think that humans are, well,
long pause for Peter Thiel.
Yeah. Well, let me come back to that question, because I think that, for each of the sort of tech leaders and for each of the products, I think there's different answers to what are they trying to do in the world, right? What is the change they're trying to see in the world? And I would say that Facebook and Meta, at least when I was working there, it seems to have, and in the years before that, and it seems to have faded a little bit more now, but there was a lot of I would say borderline theology around connecting the world. That is we want to connect, we want to foster relationships, we want to foster connection, we want to expose people to new ideas, we want people from different cultures to meet each other. That was so deeply ingrained in the culture of the company, and it was like used as like this rallying cry of like, no matter what like bad we're doing in the world or like the ways that we're harming people, there is this North Star of like this mission. And I think connecting the world was the tagline of Facebook for a while. And so it certainly was the mantra. And so I think that like there is this kind of like pro-social goal that like I think gets Mark Zuckerberg out of bed in the morning and like people in the company that's not just about making money. And I think different companies, depending on what the product is, have, you know, like at TikTok, for example, the motto of TikTok, does anyone know what the motto of TikTok is? No, it's create joy. Okay, and so like, which sounds very like communist, like Chinese Communist Party sort of, you know, but like it actually like does drive a lot of the decision making in the company. Like when we were deciding, you know, this policy or that policy, do we like, you know, make this thing, this kind of content policy violating or not policy violating? The question people would always ask is like, does this create joy? Right, like it was actually like a North Star for decision making in the company. And so, so I think there are some like, you know, pro-social theology, for lack of a better word, that drives a lot of these companies. But I also think, you know, particularly I think Molly, you were also asking specifically about this kind of like drive towards productivity and like efficiency. And it's like, okay, if humans are not going to be have to doing this drudge work, they're going to have this open space. What do these companies have a vision for what's going to fill that open space? And I don't really think so. I think that like, first of all, I think a lot of these companies are populated by hyper-productive life hackers. Like that's how you get to a position of leadership in these companies, is that you're just like one of these people who's just like uses every millisecond of your day efficiently. And like, I was just blown away at like how hard people work. It's one of the reasons I left, because it's such a burnout culture. Like people are just like super hyper productive, and like that becomes an ends unto itself. And I haven't really heard it. I don't know if you've heard in your reporting people being like, oh, like let's clear off all this busy work so that we can live the good life in some vision of the good life. It's not. I actually think probably the unspoken goal is like, let's clear off space so you can be more productive and you can do twice as much work in your day, not so that you can do the same amount of work and just be the same productive, or do less work and be just as productive. It's like, no, let's just clear off space so that you can do more work. And so that's kind of how, at least that's, I think, the mindset that I've more unconsciously think. I haven't heard really people articulate what is, you know, how this is going to lead to like a different way of being in the world with like more time and space.
It's like, I thought it's a really beautiful and profound question. And I actually do hate to directly quote Elon Musk's tweet in response to part of it, but one thing that did come to my mind is like a year ago, in the middle of the night, Musk tweeted, "Atheism left an empty space. We need something to take its place. Maybe religion's not so bad to keep you from being sad." I really hate that was stuck in my head. But like, I do think that it's very telling for someone like him who, like, we do know he's kind of constantly performing in public what it means to be like the richest person in the world, like probably one of the busiest. Like he's running all of these companies until recently was doing Doge. Like how does he have time? And yet like obviously has this kind of gnawing sense of like, what is this all building toward, or what does it mean? And I thought like it was interesting that around that time we also saw like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson Joe Rogan particularly, who used to talk a lot about atheism and then talked on his podcast about losing his grandmother and starting to feel this sort of sense of spiritual unease. And so I think like part one is I do think that like people working on some of the like kind of largest, thorniest questions on the one hand are like constructing their day-to-day often so that they don't have time to be preoccupied by these like, or, you know, they're trying to avoid thinking about these big existential questions, but also can't avoid it because what they're doing is so destabilizing all of our like norms and institutions and ways of being. I also think that, like, I think we saw this really clearly recently with the Charlie Kirk assassination, that like in these moments of just like massive disruption, I think like the way we normally live our lives is so profoundly kind of shaken up that people, like we see people grasping in all directions for like spiritual meaning. And I mean, I thought like the day that Charlie Kirk was shot, the video, which was so graphic, like I just kept seeing it everywhere on people's screens where you could see like blood spurting out. And I think to like encounter that sort of like crazy moment and feel like it's happening more and more, and it like does sort of send people casting around for like some kind of spiritual comfort and like sense of meaning and sense of like institution that is promising you a path forward. And I just think that like the memorial service that was held for him, that was like one of the largest probably displays of like Christian faith that united, like had the president and the vice president and then just all these leaders on the right coming together, and then people from around the country coming there to talk about Kirk as like a saint, I think was such a telling kind of moment for why people are finding some of that language so comforting right now, because it makes sense of what is such a chaotic and destabilizing moment. And then I also think that the difference between having at that memorial Erica Kirk standing up there and talking about forgiving the killer, and then Trump saying, sorry, Erica, but I hate my enemies, was like another really telling moment that like within this like religious, spiritual environment that like so many people are playing in right now, there's a million different directions of what that can mean for people and what it justifies. I guess to your point about the cynicism. And then the third thing I would just say is like, I've been struck by how much actually there's like a comfort for some tech leaders in being in spaces of like deep religiosity and feeling like there's an interesting fitting together of their worldview and the work they're doing and ultra Christian communities. And I saw this actually, like I just think a lot about like at this pronatalism convention. It was basically like 50% Christian conservatives and 50% tech. Like we are worried about the fertility rate because of the crisis it will mean for workers and the economy. And the Christians being there saying like, no, we should put families back at the center of American life. And yet like there was a lot of just joy in that alliance and like not a lot of discomfort. Like I think there was discomfort around like IVF, which wasn't really talked about because that's an area of deep disagreement for those communities. But I think that like for people who are working at these like really like large scale sense of change and questions and remaking of society, there's like a comfort and an energy around like saying, how can we fit that together with the way that religious communities, which have been wrestling with these questions about longevity and death and like what human life means and why we work for forever, like actually it's very convenient if those two communities can come together and find a common language.
That's great. Lloyd Barba from Amherst.
Thanks so much for sharing your ideas on these matters. So I want to go back to a thread that Jason and Bill both asked about AI and Peter Thiel. And I'm curious, so there's a point that you made about critics of AI as an antichrist. And I do teach a course on the end of the world where we look at the Antichrist, figures of the Antichrist. And my takeaway for the students has always been, the prophets who predict the Antichrist, the prophets who predict the mark of the beast. It's really just, they're offering themselves an undue sense of explanatory power, right? That this is a big conspiracy that's coming against us. So I think there's an extent to which Thiel's reasoning around Antichrist, who are critics of AI, can perhaps just be superficial or just a provocative point, but I'm wondering if there's anything that he has to offer as to what is Christian in particular about AI. And the way I'm hearing, the way I've read Thiel in the past, and the way I've sort of heard him describe, offering meaning making when there's a vacuum, there's yet something to be filled there. And I'm wondering if you would go as far as to say that Thiel sees tech as transcendent. And if that's a way of thinking about it, one of the other courses I teach is on the theories and methods of religion. And we have a rather conservative sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, who has this idea of the sacred canopy. And in Berger's conception of the sacred canopy, there's the idea that the nomos, or the law, the meaning of the value, is stretched over a society. And in cases of mass death or just death, we have a disruption of it. So we have to figure out how to restitch that sacred canopy. And if I'm reading Thiel correctly, I can't help but to think, in this world of AI in which you can't tell if you're speaking to a real person or their avatar, is that itself not a kind of enemy, right? In a sense that, we can't differentiate, what is the real versus what is a mimesis of it, what is an imitation. And if they're not just simply providing a solution for a problem they've created, and in a way becoming their own saviors, right? Teal as a savior of this problem we have, or this vacuum of meaning in life, and filling it with just this AI business that I don't know if it's quite the solution. Which obviously I don't think is a solution, but I'm wondering how you work around some of that logic there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear your perspective specifically. I haven't been tracking the whole Antichrist, certainly not as deeply as you have. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for you that you've had to go deep into that world on all of our behalf. But my sense is that it is more about the enemy side of that theology is more finely crafted than the savior side of it, right? And that there is this sense, so it's less about like tech is Christ, critics of tech are antichrist. It's more the latter half of that sentence, of that logic chain that feels more finely tuned. But there's certainly a strong implication about that front side. And I do think that, like your question, one of the questions you asked is like, well, what is it about tech that is Christ-like or sort of spiritually positive in that way? And I think that, different people will have different answers to that question, but I think there's generally this sense that like progress is Christian, or like is like a value in Christianity, right? And we've seen this throughout. Molly can probably give us lots of historical parallels for this, right? And I don't know, maybe it's related to prosperity gospel, but like just this sense that like, society is moving forward, and that like technology progress is inherently good for society, and anyone who's standing in the way of progress is bad, right? And so I wouldn't say that it's like, I haven't seen a lot of like sophistication around like what is the specific ways in which this technology is actually going to be advancing society. And like, there's lots of good, you could make good, I think these technologies do have lots of good benefit and value to society. So I think it wouldn't be a hard argument to make, but I think they spend less time. There's sort of almost like an assumption, maybe because they're preaching to the choir, because it's like everyone in the room already agrees that AI is Christ and good. And then so like, let's spend our time thinking about who's the Antichrist. That's like the more interesting part for, I think, him and his audience. I do think that, I think there's an interesting question to be had about what is real and what is fake. And I think that AI is actually really, and generative AI in particular, is going to push us to reevaluate what falls into those categories in the way that like, an email used to be seen as fake or like not like a real communication with somebody or a text message. And now it's seen as like a perfectly justified way of connecting with someone. And like, I'll give an example. I was talking with Eugene during the break that like, I had it was a week where I was very sick. And so I just could not write thoughtful anything. And a congregant wrote me an email that was like very kind of like wrought ethical challenge that she was grappling with. And I was like, oh, I do not have the brain cells to like respond to this email today. And so I was like, okay, I've never done this before. I'm going to put her email into ChatGPT, and I'm going to ask ChatGPT to write a response for me. And because I use ChatGPT to proofread everything that I write, it actually has a repository of all my sermons and writings in it. And so it's actually very good at approximating my voice. And so it wrote this response to her that was beautiful. Like it was way more compassionate than I would ever be, way more patient. It like wove in teaching from scriptures. It wove in some of my past teachings. It's like, as I taught a few weeks ago from the story of like, and I was just like, wow. And I was like, all right, I'm going to send this. And so I sent it to her, and she was so touched. She was just like, oh my God, thank you. The fact that you took all this time to write this to me, and it's so wise, and like, it's exactly what I needed to hear, and thank you so much, and And so it got me like thinking of like, okay, I think she would probably be upset if she knew that this was written by AI, right? And it would not feel like, it would not feel real, as real as it came from me. But I think that that's because we're in this like learning curve, we're in this adoption curve right now, where it's seen as this kind of like weird foreign technology. And actually, I don't know about all of you, but I'm at a point right now where when I receive a very well-written email, I just assume it was written by ChatGPT. Like if something's like, hey, thanks, bye, I'm like, okay, that was a human who wrote that. Or someone's like, dear Rabbi Krieger, thank you so much for, I was like, okay, that was not written by a human. But I don't think most people think that. I think just because I'm familiar with like AI style. But I think there will come a point actually where someone will email their clergy and they will get a response from that clergy person's GPT. And it won't be as good as getting a response from the clergy, but it will be its own value proposition, right? Like by being a member of my congregation, you get access to my GPT, which is trained by all of my sermons and all of my writings, and then I will review it before it goes out to make sure that it's sort of, aligned with my values. But like that is going to become a form of communication, right? And so I think that, and we could continue going down this road, but there's lots of other examples of this, but I think like what we define as like real authentic communication is going to be changed by AI and how when AI becomes more adopted in a more widespread way.
Jen from Yale.
Is this working?
You
Okay.
bet.
I have a couple of questions that kind of blur into each other, and also it's also more of a think with me. I'm going to think aloud here. But as I'm hearing a lot of Peter Thiel and talking about the Antichrist, and both Lloyd and I think about the Antichrist in the end times. And one thing he said, I mean, I'm teaching a course right now on Revelation, and it's history of interpretation, right? And I remember Thiel saying, we need to look at these end time prophecies and the apocalyptic prophecies. Someone really needs to think deeply about them. And I was like so offended because I'm like, we have been, Peter. But that makes me think, like, what is the role of the scholar in the public sphere at this point, especially with the erosion of higher ed, closing of religion departments, and closing of PhD students' programs, of like, what really is it's kind of nihilistic, but what is the point when someone like Thiel can take the stage and talk about end times and all that? I could deconstruct, and I've thought about this a lot as I've been encouraged to write about this publicly, is like, is this really something that will make a difference? Like, I could do the historical gotcha, right? Like, and that is usually the shtick of a biblical scholar, is to be like, actually, Paul didn't, in the first century, people didn't actually, that's the usual thing that they want biblical scholars to do. But actually, I don't think that's very effective because, like Zvika, I agree. Scripture can be interpreted in multiple different ways. And if you use the historical gotcha, it's going to come back and bite you in the ass, right? Like, if I say, the Antichrist isn't actually mentioned in 2 Thessalonians, that's the man of lawlessness, and it's actually in 1 and 2 John, does it really matter, first of all, in the public sphere? And the second, he could come back and say, but Paul does talk about the transcendence of the body. And I'm like, you're right. Like, does that mean that therefore is ethical, right? Like, it doesn't, the historical gotcha is only utilized to a certain point. And then I think Revelation is full of violent imagery. And if you're going to embrace it, that's historically correct. Like, what am I going to do about that? So, like, what is the point? And also, I don't, what is the audience for that? The times when we do come out and speak, I feel like everyone who's already listening to me is already agreeing with me. So what is really that role? The one thing that was really struck me, though, as weaves in Molly's comment, is thinking about the deep thinking that has to go into scholarship to think about what is religion, what is the marrow, I think, of some of these things, and like the nuance of long history. And I don't know if there's a forum for that. But one thing that struck me, too, is another question I had is, what is the body and embodiment? How does that connect to tech and AI, right? Like, what is missing? Because like one of the marrow essentials, I think, unless you're a hardcore Docetist from the 2nd century, is to say, the incarnation, the fleshly existence of Jesus, is part of Christianity and the belief that God became a human being, right? So like, if that's the case, how does that get put into the, from a Christian perspective, and Thiel is really thinking about it in that way, and his idea of transcendence and eternal life and, all of this thing, how do you incorporate embodiment? And there's some things like AI teaches us what we want, right? But there's something about, like, if you want your mother to be back alive again, you can talk to her and all that, but that's from yourself. Like, also you can, like, you're feeding AI what you have. So we have what we need, I guess, in some ways. And like, but what we can't do is embodiment, at least not yet. So like, I don't know what we do when we get to that point, but like, you can't hold your mother's hand, right? You can't go on a walk with her, or she can't cook you a meal. You can't eat with her, right? Like, huh?
Soon,
okay. Okay, so like, I guess like to throw in embodiment. So anyways, that was a lot, but just like thinking aloud of like those points of, yeah.
That was so many wonderful points. On the embodiment point, I think a lot about like embodiment is almost like the twin of, or I guess like it very much in conversation with authenticity. Because when you think about like you're in correspondence with like a chatbot, or a chatbot has like taken over your voice to like write your correspondences or do your first drafts or anything, like what is that any less authentic than you? But that I think is a very real question that's worth like wrestling with. Like what is, it's, even if it can, I guess I feel like maybe I'm a little bit less, I'm a little bit more bearish on it right now, at least in my own life or circles, than it sounds like you are in terms of how you're using it. Like when I've never used AI to write a draft of anything, but I like have, I guess, used it to write like correspondences sometimes, and I feel like the gap between my voice and AI's is so noticeable. And I like, even as an experiment, I was like, okay, I'm gonna have it take over all my communications for a week. And like got calls from coworkers immediately being like, are you mad at me? This doesn't sound like you. And so I probably wasn't using it correctly, and I'm further from that circle. But like, I feel like there are so many like questions about authenticity to wrestle with, but I think of those also as like the kind of, as connected to the embodiment conversation, because I do think we're heading to the moment, like not so far away, when like we'll have, like you'll be able to hold, like Zvika was saying, like the physical hand of your deceased mother, like in some sort of form. And so then the question under that becomes like, okay, but how much, like where is the truth, and where is the emotional truth and the physical truth in that interaction? So yeah, I don't know. I think like the embodiment question is sort of like changing in real time, but is very linked to questions about authenticity and truth. There's a lot to wrestle with. Can you remind me of the first part of your question? Because I wanted to say something about
The role of scholars.
Oh, the role of,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I'm also really glad you brought that up, because I have just seen this like explosion all over social media of spiritual influencers, and the algorithm just accelerates and amplifies any voice that is doing like the kind of the sound bites, the like saying in basically 30 seconds something that like really shakes people awake. And I see that so much in terms of when I interview young people about like what voices of like spiritual authority they have in their lives, they talk about podcasters. And it's not clergy, it's like people who have podcasts that touch on faith in different ways. And so then my like initial like that like kind of immediate question that comes to mind like is like, oh, but is that like a credentialed spiritual authority, or do you really trust that voice? Like, what is a trusted voice? But it doesn't really matter, like, because that's the voice that's flooding their platforms, and so that's the voice they're going to listen to. And I think that makes it all the more important to like find ways to continue getting out the voices of scholars. And I think of it as like basically critics. There's a great, there's a book I love called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas, and he has a chapter called The Thought Leader versus the Critic. And basically he argues that like our systems of higher education, information, like media right now are structured to reward people who become thought leaders rather than critics. And thought leaders take an idea, they realize it's traveling, and so they keep like honing it and thinking about like what will travel the fastest and the furthest rather than what's most inconvenient to everyone to hear. And he uses as an example like Amy Cuddy, who is a professor who became prominent for this idea of like power postures, that like women, if they orient their bodies in certain ways, will be taken more seriously. And then she gave a TED Talk, and the TED Talk went viral. And so all of a sudden she became like the power posture person rather than like a critic who was kind of continuously evolving her thinking to be thorny and inconvenient and challenging for people who encounter it. So I think like definitely our systems of information and our media and social media are like structured to accelerate and amplify the thought leaders and the podcasters and the kind of influencers. And so it's even more important to keep thinking about then like where are the spaces for the critics to like find the cracks and jump in.
So many things to say. I think like on the role of the scholar, like I'm actually curious, and maybe even want to throw the question back to you. Like I imagine that this is not a new dynamic that's being wrestled with, which is like what is the balance between academics, or maybe even let's just say theologians, which I know is not synonymous with academics, and spiritual leaders, right? In the sense that like, I think my guess is that historically, it's not the people who are like in pulpits or who are like preaching out to people who are the ones who are like really driving the major sort of theological revolutions or like the deep thinking, that there's always this kind of dance between like the people in the academy or the seminary who are like doing the deep thinking, and then there's like the translators out to the general population. And I imagine that there's often tension when this sort of the pulpit, the translators, when they start taking on the role of theologian, like maybe like this like Peter Thiel example, where it's like, hey, like you can't do that. You're just like a thought leader, you know, like you're just like like it's our job, it's the expert's job to like generate new theology, and it's your job to just like popularize and scale like what we're saying. And I have to imagine that like there are other times in history where that tension has evolved, where it's like people who are not the smartest, you know, like often it's like actually like the most popular sermon, spiritual leaders and community leaders were like the worst students in seminary, right? Like they're not the ones who are like the most deeply grasping, because like that it's different skills, and sometimes you have like the perfect combination of like the two of them. And so I think it's like that tension is probably like not a new tension, and I find it interesting from that perspective. I also do think like you were talking about sort of like, you know, this tension of like new spiritual leaders coming through social media, and like what's their authority, and like if they're saying things that are resonating with people, like is that really all that matters, right? It's like who cares how learned they are or if they have a stamp of approval. I do think one difference between like kind of, I would just call them like Insta influencers, you know, spiritual influencers, is that they actually, one thing they're lacking is generally like accountability. Right? That if you are the spiritual leader of a community, you have a community that's generally holding you accountable. Or if you're if you're from like a denomination, that denomination has like an ethics board or has like a leadership team that can hold you accountable in some way. And so I do think that that's what scares me a little bit about, you know, again, like I'm all for like shaking the hierarchies and like bringing new voices in and democratizing spiritual leadership, but I do worry about the lack of accountability. On the embodiment piece, I have a lot of things to say. You said some things I was going to say, but maybe just one thing I'll throw in here is like, I think it's also important when we talk about the growth of spirituality in Silicon Valley. I think it's also important to bring in the growth of psychedelics in Silicon Valley. Like there's a huge Venn diagram like of this like psychedelic renaissance is being driven by a lot of the leaders in Silicon Valley. A lot of them are funding, you know, there's a lot of that nexus. And I think that it gets to like maybe some of the stuff that Molly and Sophie that you were talking about like transcendence and transformation and like efficiency, right? Like psychedelics are basically like a really efficient way to have a life hacking way to have a spiritual experience, right? It's like instead of like doing the deep work of like building up your spiritual practice, like just pay some shaman, you know, like $500 and you can have a transcendent experience and largely transformational experience like immediately. And I think that like one of the things that makes psychedelics so powerful is that it's a visceral experience of the divine, or can be a visceral experience of the divine, or, you know, depending on your orientation, you could just say it's like a neurological tricking you into thinking that you're experiencing the divine, you know, in a short period of time. And like when people are looking for things that are not just like abstract intellectual conversations, but actually like they want to have an experience of transcendence, I think the growth of psychedelics in Silicon Valley and probably elsewhere too is maybe a symptom of that, or another indication of that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emma Goldberg. Thank you, Rabbi Krieger. It was really great.